Hey everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know in comments where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. Moving into the house on Maple Street wasn't supposed to feel like this. I had hoped a change of scenery would help me move on, erase some of the pain from the divorce. The house was cheap, almost too cheap, and I'd been desperate for something new after everything that had happened. It wasn't much, just a two-story home that looked like it had been built in the 1920s. It had that old, musty smell you expect from a place that had been neglected for a while. The creaky floorboards, the peeling wallpaper, the dim light that barely came through the heavy curtains, everything about it screamed untouched for decades, but I wasn't complaining. It was mine and that was enough. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, set up a few things, and tried to get used to the sound of silence. I had grown accustomed to the noise of family, of conversations that had filled the air for years. Now, there was nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling, like a giant stretching after a long nap. I'd met the neighbor, Mrs. Miller, on the first day I arrived. She lived in the house next door, a small, neat place with flowers in the front yard. She was in her late 70s, maybe early 80s, and had a kind face, though her eyes held something that felt wary. I think she was just lonely like me. She invited me over for coffee and we sat on her porch chatting about everything and nothing. "I see you've moved into the old Thompson house," she said after a while, sipping her drink. Her voice was soft, but there was a strange tension in her words. "It's a good place, I suppose. Quiet. That's what you want, right?" I nodded, trying not to read too much into her tone. "Just," she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. "Just be careful. A lot of people have had strange things happen in that house. You hear noises at night, strange sounds. It's an old place. Don't let it get to you." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of sounds?" She looked away, her hands fidgeting with her cup. "Footsteps mostly. Creaking doors. Some people say they've seen things, but I don't know. I just thought you should know. Be careful." She left it at that and I didn't press her. The conversation felt like a warning, but I didn't feel threatened. I was just another person starting over, and the house, despite its age and quirks, was nothing more than a place to sleep. Or so I told myself. That first night, as I settled into my new room, I felt a slight unease. The house was cold, colder than I expected, and no matter how high I turned the heat, the chill wouldn't go away. I dismissed it as nothing more than the drafts that old houses tend to have. As I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe the house just settling like it had the day before. But then it came again, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking through the hallway upstairs. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I told myself it was just the house's age. Old houses creak, settle, make strange noises. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the better of me. So I closed my eyes, rolled over, and tried to sleep. But the footsteps came again. Closer this time, and with an odd, deliberate rhythm. I held my breath, listening. I could hear the sound of them, heavy, dragging, like someone was pacing back and forth. I sat up in bed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. No, it was just the house, that's all. But when I turned my head to glance toward the door, I thought I saw something. A shadow in the hallway, faint but unmistakable. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I had just moved in and everything was new. I was still adjusting. Old houses had quirks. That's all. I rolled over again, pulling the blankets tighter around me, but sleep didn't come easy. The footsteps didn't stop. The next morning, I woke up feeling more tired than I'd like to admit. The strange sounds from the night before still lingered in my mind, but I tried to push them aside. It wasn't anything to be afraid of, I told myself. It was just an old house with a lot of character that I would soon get used to. I spent the day unpacking more boxes and organizing what little furniture I had. The house felt less empty with each passing hour, but it still had that oppressive weight to it. The heavy silence seemed to settle in every corner, creeping up on me whenever I wasn't paying attention. Around midday, I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. Mrs. Miller was sitting on her porch again, her eyes watching me as I approached. She greeted me with a small smile, but there was something off in the way she looked at me, almost like she was assessing me. "You get settled in okay?" she asked, her voice soft but thick with something unspoken. I nodded. "Yeah, just trying to adjust." She looked at the house for a moment, then back at me. "I thought you might." "But," She trailed off, then seemed to catch herself. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Her words felt heavier than they should have, like there was something she wasn't saying. But before I could ask her about it, she stood up, her old joints creaking as she did. "I should be going. Got a few things to take care of," she said, stepping into her house without another word. Her cryptic tone stayed with me as I went back inside, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just her way of being polite, maybe a little too cautious for someone who didn't know me very well. I had plenty to do. That night, as I settled into bed, the unease crept back in. I had grown used to the sounds of the house during the day, the creaking of the floors, the groan of the beams, but at night it felt different. Like the house was alive, breathing, whispering to me from the walls. At first I thought I imagined it. It was faint, almost inaudible, the sound of something scraping against wood like nails being dragged slowly across a surface. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. The noise came from the walls, behind the plaster, deep within the house's old bones. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. I had told myself I wouldn't let my imagination get the best of me. But this was different. The sound was too distinct to ignore. The scraping stopped for a moment, and in the silence I thought I heard something else. Whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo from every corner. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to rationalize it. It had to be the wind, or maybe the pipes, or even the house itself settling. But the whispers grew louder, clearer, and I realized they weren't random. They were words. Get out. Leave. Not welcome. My blood ran cold and I couldn't move. The words weren't just sounds. They were commands. A warning. I forced myself to stand, despite the paralyzing fear settling in my chest. The house felt colder now, the temperature dropping so suddenly I could see my breath in the air. I slowly made my way to the door, my hand trembling on the knob as I stepped into the hallway. Nothing. The house was as silent as it had been before. The whispering had stopped, and the temperature had returned to normal, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it all. But I knew I hadn't. I went to the living room and tried to distract myself, but sleep was a distant thought. My eyes kept flicking to the corners of the room, to the darkened spaces where I couldn't see. The walls felt closer somehow, as if they were watching me. That night, the sounds didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Something in the house, something that knew I was listening. Something that didn't want me to stay. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had changed overnight. It wasn't just the usual creaks or groans, it was something more. Something in the air, thick with unease, making the walls feel like they were closing in. But I didn't want to dwell on it. I had already let my mind wander too far. The divorce had left me shaken, and this new place was supposed to be a fresh start. So I forced myself to focus on the little tasks that kept my mind occupied: cleaning, unpacking, putting things away. As I was sorting through a box of old books, one caught my eye, a worn leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. It wasn't something I had packed, nor was it something I'd noticed before in the house. Curiosity piqued, I opened it, flipping through the fragile pages until I found a place that seemed to have writing in it. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, almost manic. It was clear from the first sentence that the person who had written this wasn't in their right mind. Asterisk, the house is speaking again. It calls to me, whispers in the night. I can feel its presence, always watching, always waiting. The rituals must be completed. The door must remain closed or all will be lost. Asterisk. I stopped reading, my stomach twisting. I flipped back a few pages, reading more of the entries. The person who wrote this seemed to have been obsessed with the house itself, convinced that it was more than just a building. The name at the end of the diary entry was Thomas Green. I hadn't heard the name before, but I didn't think much of it at the time. What caught my attention more was the mention of rituals and a door that must remain closed. I didn't want to go deeper, but the idea of something hidden in this house gnawed at me, pulling me in. So I kept reading. The journal entries became increasingly disturbing, filled with detailed descriptions of occult practices, spells, incantations, symbols, and rituals. They all seemed focused on something within the house, something that had been locked away for decades. Thomas Green's obsession with the supernatural was evident. One entry described an event where he had opened the door to whatever lay hidden in the house. After that, the tone shifted from confusion to pure terror. Asterisk, I made a mistake. The door was never meant to be opened. The presence is here now. It watches me. It waits. I hear it in the walls, in the floorboards. It moves when I sleep. It speaks to me. It tells me to finish the work. It tells me to join it. Asterisk. I could feel my skin prickling as I read those words, as if the house itself was aware that I was looking into its past, that I was uncovering something I shouldn't. I closed the journal abruptly, placing it back in the box. My hands trembled and I felt a surge of unease. The noises, the whispers, it all started to make sense in a way I wasn't ready for. But as I stood up, the feeling in the room shifted. The air grew heavy, thick with the same suffocating weight I had felt the night before. Something was watching me. The house was aware. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. No shadow in the corner. No cold breeze. Just the silence. But it was the silence that unnerved me. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for me to leave that journal alone. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the weight of the journal's words pressing down on me. I knew I had to find out more about Thomas Green, about the house's history. But something inside me screamed not to. I had already uncovered too much. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again, the footsteps. Slow and deliberate, walking through the hall. I told myself it was just my imagination, a result of my mind running wild with what I'd read. But the steps grew louder, closer. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened, straining to hear any other sounds. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. No, not a whisper. A voice. It was low, almost too soft to hear, but it was there. Finish what you started. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice sounded so real, so close, as if it was right behind me. I turned to look at the empty space beside my bed, but of course there was nothing there. I jumped out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor as I rushed to the door. I wasn't going to stay in this house another night. I wasn't sure what I had uncovered, but I knew I was in over my head. The door slammed shut as I reached for the handle, trapping me inside. It was as if the house itself was telling me I wasn't going anywhere. I couldn't leave. I couldn't escape the house, not after everything that had happened. The door had locked on its own, and the sense of something watching me had never been so palpable. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, reminding myself that panic would only make things worse. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I decided to do something I had avoided. Explore the house more thoroughly. I had already unpacked most of my things and I needed to understand more about this place. The journal's warnings, the whispers, the footsteps, it was all too much to ignore. The house wasn't just old, it was haunted. There was something inside it, something far darker than I had anticipated. I started in the basement not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The basement was the only part of the house I hadn't fully explored. It was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and mildew. The stairs creaked under my weight, groaning like they hadn't been used in years. I reached the bottom of the stairs and immediately, a cold chill swept through me, sinking into my bones. The room felt suffocating, the shadows crawling across the walls. There were boxes and old furniture scattered around, most of it covered in sheets. I tried not to think about the dust settling on everything, but the unease was overwhelming. It felt as though I wasn't alone. There was a door at the far end of the basement, one I had never noticed before. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of old furniture. My heart pounded as I approached it, the air growing heavier with every step. I reached for the doorknob, but my hand hesitated. The door felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for me to touch it. When I finally turned the knob and pushed the door open, the smell hit me immediately, something foul, like rot and decay. The small room was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was filled with old books, papers, and strange artifacts, some of them half buried in piles of dust. But what caught my attention the most was the symbol carved into the floor. It wasn't a simple mark. It was intricate, a series of looping shapes and lines that seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light. The moment I stepped into the room, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, as if the very air in here was thick with malevolent energy. I knelt down, brushing some of the dust away to get a closer look at the symbol. It looked like some sort of occult ritual, something that didn't belong in a house like this. As my fingers traced the outline of the symbol, I felt a sudden, sharp chill run down my spine. A cold hand seemed to grip my heart. Something was here, something had been here, and it was waiting. Suddenly, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps again echoing in the basement. This time they were louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat and I quickly stood up, scanning the room. There was no one there, nothing but the shadows that clung to the walls. Then I saw it, a book on the far side of the room, half open, its pages yellowed with age. The title was too faded to make out, but I felt an overwhelming need to look inside. I rushed over, my hands trembling as I opened the book. The first page was blank, but as I flipped through it, I came across strange drawings and symbols, similar to the ones on the floor. The text was written in a language I couldn't understand, but the words seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though the book itself was alive. There was a single entry in English that caught my eye, written hastily as if the author was in a hurry to finish it. Asterisk, the door is open now. The door is never meant to be opened. What was trapped will walk free. We cannot stop it. Asterisk, my heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was what I had been looking for, the explanation, the history of this cursed place. The door. Whatever had been trapped inside for so long was now free, and I had unwittingly unlocked it. As I stood there, frozen in fear, I heard the whispering again. It was louder now, clearer, as if the house itself was speaking to me. Asterisk, finish the work. Asterisk, my mind raced. Was the house trying to compel me to do something? To finish whatever ritual had been started? I couldn't bear to stay in the room any longer. My legs moved on their own, carrying me back to the stairs. But as I reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me in the room. Panic surged through me and I pulled at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The cold seemed to intensify, filling the room with an unnatural chill that sank deep into my bones. Then I heard something else, low, guttural breathing from the corner of the room, followed by a soft, scraping sound. I turned, my eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows, creeping along the walls, twisting in ways they shouldn't. I didn't wait another second. I forced the door open, stumbling out into the basement hall. The footsteps followed me, now a heavy, deliberate pace. I ran up the stairs, not daring to look back as the whispers grew louder, closer, echoing in my ears. Finish what you started. The house felt different when I returned to the living room. It was as if everything had shifted while I was in the basement. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thick with the same oppressive energy I had felt earlier. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that something had changed. Something was awake now. The journal, the footsteps, the whispers, they were all connected. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive in some way, a presence that fed on fear and paranoia. And I was feeding it by staying here, by uncovering its secrets. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched as I moved through the house, my movements hurried and erratic. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this place before it consumed me too. But every time I reached the front door, it felt like something was holding me back, like an invisible force was preventing me from escaping. The door wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked, yet it wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, but it was as if the house itself had decided that I wasn't going anywhere. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, and in that moment, the house seemed to groan, the floorboards creaking under some unseen weight. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath mist in front of me. It felt as if something or someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. I turned around quickly, but again there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching out in front of me. Then I heard it, a soft, raspy breath right behind me. I froze, paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. It was like my body had betrayed me, leaving me trapped in this nightmare. I felt a presence, something standing just inches away from me. I could sense it like a cold, dark shadow pressing against me, suffocating me. I dared not look back, knowing that whatever it was would be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The whispers started again, this time louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions, as if the house itself was speaking to me. Finish what you started. The words echoed in my mind over and over, until they became a maddening chant. I tried to cover my ears, to block them out, but it was impossible. The words were inside my head, twisting and turning, digging into my thoughts. Then I heard it, the soft scrape of something heavy moving across the floor, getting closer. I turned around, and for a split second I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the hallway. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its outline, the way it loomed in the doorway, its form stretching unnaturally tall. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unforgiving. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, tight with terror. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the figure. It felt like the very essence of fear, like it had crawled out of the darkest corners of my mind and into the real world. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel its intentions. It wanted something from me. It needed me to do something, finish something. But what? What was I supposed to do? The whispers grew louder, more desperate. Finish the work, they cried. The door is open. The curse is upon you. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. My legs shook, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't stop moving. I had to get out of here. I had to leave, but I couldn't. The house wouldn't let me. I reached the stairs and turned, running up them as fast as I could. But as I reached the top, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, freezing me in place. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hand, the touch, it was like an icy chill that seeped into my bones. The figure was still there at the end of the hallway, but now it was closer. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed a faint, sickly green, staring into my soul. It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. The thing standing in front of me wasn't alive, not in any way I understood. I bolted down the hallway, nearly tripping over my feet, and threw myself into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I tried to catch my breath, but the air was thick, suffocating, and every noise around me seemed magnified. The house was alive, and it was waiting for me to finish whatever had been started. I pressed my back against the door, not trusting it for a second, as if that would somehow keep the thing outside. But I knew it was futile. The house would find a way in. I turned to the bed, and for a moment I thought I saw the shape of a figure sitting there, waiting for me. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, as though the house itself was mocking me. Finish the work. It was getting harder to breathe, harder to think. The house had a hold on me now, and I couldn't shake it. Suddenly, I felt a wave of cold wash over me. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. And then, I felt it, the sensation of something sitting on the edge of the bed beside me, its weight pressing down on the mattress. It was real. This wasn't my imagination. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up in terror, knowing that whatever was with me in that room wasn't something I could escape. Not now. Not ever. I had to leave. I knew I had to, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. My mind raced, frantic thoughts colliding, but all I could focus on was the cold presence beside me, the weight pressing down on the bed. It was like something, or someone, was sitting there, its unseen body slowly crushing the mattress under its oppressive force. The temperature in the room had plummeted, and my breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as I strained to hear anything at all, that could explain what was happening. The whispers were still there, growing louder, more insistent. But now there was something else. A voice, soft, low, but unmistakably real. It was coming from the corner of the room just behind me. Finish what you started. I couldn't tell if the voice was male or female. It was neither, and both at the same time, a strange amalgamation of sound that made my skin crawl. It was like the voice of the house itself, an entity that had been lying dormant, waiting for its moment. The weight on the bed shifted, and I felt the presence lean closer, closer still. I could hear its breath now, shallow, labored. The sound of something far too close. Something not human. I wanted to turn, to look, but I was frozen in place. I couldn't. The voice had paralyzed me, its power stronger than any fear I had ever known. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching, distorting as if they had a mind of their own. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, my body trembling uncontrollably. The house was alive, breathing, pulsing with energy, and I was trapped in its grasp. The voice came again, clearer this time, as if it had crawled into my ear. Asterisk, you can't leave. You won't leave. Not until it's finished. Asterisk. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as though something had pierced me from the inside. I gasped for air, but the cold was suffocating and I could barely move. My fingers clung to the bed frame as if it was the only thing holding me together. The thing on the bed moved again, and I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to see it. I had to know what it was. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head, my body resisting every inch of movement, as if the very act of turning would break me. And there it was. A figure, shrouded in shadow, sitting on the edge of the bed, its form indistinct but undeniably real. Its shape was like a silhouette, a person, or perhaps something worse, something far beyond human. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to move, to shift and contort in ways that weren't possible. I could barely see its face, but I didn't need to. I could feel its eyes, cold and empty, boring into me from the darkness. Its presence suffocated me, pressing down on my chest, on my soul. It was here, in this room, and I knew that it would not leave until it had taken what it wanted. The voice spoke again, its tone full of cruel satisfaction. Asterisk, you opened the door. You freed me. Now you must pay the price. Asterisk. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face, but the house, the thing in the room, would not relent. My heart hammered in my chest, the fear nearly overwhelming, but I couldn't move. I couldn't run. It was then that I remembered the journal, the rituals, the warnings, the curse. This house had been built on something far darker than I had ever realized. Whatever had been trapped here, whatever had been waiting, was not just a ghost, not just a spirit. It was something ancient, something hungry, and I had unwittingly set it free. I scrambled for any sense of control, any way to break free from the paralysis that gripped me. My eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything that might help me. but the shadows were closing in, and the air was too thick, too heavy to think clearly. Then I heard it, the sound of something scraping against the floor, faint at first but growing louder, moving across the room toward me. My eyes snapped back to the bed. The figure was gone. But the voice, the voice asterisk, was still there, a whisper now, right in my ear. Asterisk, it's not over. It's never over. Asterisk. I felt the bed shift again, and then a cold hand, no fingers, touched my ankle. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The grip on my ankle tightened, pulling me toward the edge of the bed. I kicked, I screamed inside my mind, but my body wouldn't respond. I glanced down, and that's when I saw it. Hands, long and bony, with fingers too thin, too many, wrapping around my ankle. The skin was gray, mottled, with veins bulging under the surface. It was not human. With a final burst of adrenaline, I wrenched my leg free, stumbling backward into the corner of the room. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows thickening, swallowing up the light. I had to leave. I had to escape. But as I turned to the door, it slammed shut before I could even reach the handle. I turned back to face the room, but now the figure was standing in the doorway. Its eyes, those glowing, soulless eyes, locked onto mine. Asterisk, you will never leave. Never. Asterisk. I bolted toward the window, desperate, clawing at the panes, but they wouldn't open. The glass was cold, unyielding, like it had been sealed shut for years. And then the whispers filled the room, all around me, drowning me in their maddening chant. Asterisk, finish what you started. Finish it. Finish it. Asterisk. The darkness closed in, and I could feel the weight of it crushing me, pulling me down into something worse than death. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't leave. I don't know how much time passed after the whispers began. It felt like hours, but the world around me had shifted into a haze, as though the boundaries of time and space had become fluid. I was trapped in a nightmare, a loop I couldn't escape from. The air was so thick now, it was like trying to breathe underwater, each breath a struggle, each movement sluggish and unnatural. I could still hear the whispers repeating over and over, a chorus of voices that seemed to seep from the very walls. Finish what you started. Finish it, they demanded. Their tone had changed now, less commanding and more desperate, like a prayer that had been offered too many times, one that had long since lost its power. I couldn't think straight. I needed to focus, to remember what had happened. But everything felt out of reach, like my memories were being swallowed up by the house, absorbed into the dark. My eyes darted around the room. The figure was still standing there in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on me, waiting for something. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence in every inch of the room. It was as if the house itself had become one with the thing, its very essence twisting and bending with the will of whatever had taken up residence here. And then something shifted. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath mist in front of me. My body trembled, but I forced myself to move, to think. I had to get out. I had to. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I froze, a scream caught in my throat. The touch was cold, like ice, like the very hand of death itself. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty air, thick with the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind a blur of panic. The house, it was playing with me. It was toying with me, dragging me deeper into its dark web. I needed to leave, but the house was a labyrinth. No matter how many times I tried to escape, the doors and windows remained locked, the walls closing in on me. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking, the whispers louder now, the voices blending together until they became a single, maddening sound. Finish it. I turned around again, desperate for some form of escape, and that's when I saw it. The journal. The one I had nearly forgotten about, the one I had found in the basement. I had to finish it. I had to know. I rushed toward the small table where the journal lay, flipping it open with trembling hands. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, but the ink was still clear, still readable. The writing was erratic, frantic, as though the original owner had been in a hurry to record something important, something urgent. The words blurred together as I scanned the pages, my eyes racing over them, searching for answers. The journal detailed the rituals, the spells, the dark incantations that had been performed in this very house, each entry more disturbing than the last. But one word kept appearing, over and over again, door, the door. The one that had been opened. The one that had unleashed whatever was in this house. As I read on, the entries became more incoherent, the writer's fear palpable in each stroke of the pen. The last entry, written just before the journal stopped, was a warning. Asterisk, do not open the door. Do not finish the work. It will follow you. Will take you. There is no escape. There is only the door. Asterisk. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The house had been built on something dark, something far older than I had realized. And now I was caught in the web of its curse. But I still didn't understand. What was this door? Where was it? What had been unleashed and what did it want from me? I had to find out. As I stood there, my thoughts racing, I heard something. A low, dragging sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, my heart sinking as I saw it. The figure. It was moving now, slowly, like it was waking up, coming to life. The darkness that surrounded it seemed to pulse with each step it took, the air thickening as it drew nearer. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. I couldn't run. I couldn't even think. The figure was right in front of me now, its face still hidden in the shadows, but its presence, its sheer, suffocating presence, filled the entire room. I could feel its breath on my skin, cold and damp, like the touch of death itself. The whispers had stopped now, but the silence was worse, heavier, like something was waiting for me to make the next move. And then it spoke. Finish what you started. The voice wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the whispering chorus. It was one voice, clear and sharp, like it had been waiting for me to hear it. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot as the figure moved closer, its form growing more solid, more real with each passing second. I could feel its presence in my bones, in my chest, in my very soul. And then the lights flickered, dimming, casting the room into shadows. For a moment I saw something, a glimpse, just a flash of something, moving behind the figure. A dark shape, a hand, a face, emerging from the darkness. But I couldn't make it out. It was too quick, too fleeting. And then the figure was gone. Just like that. I was alone again. But the house wasn't the same. It had changed, had grown darker, more oppressive, as if the very walls had absorbed whatever had been released. And I knew deep in my gut that whatever it was, whatever had been waiting, wasn't done with me yet. The door. I had to find it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that it had a pulse, a rhythm, that it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every step I took. The air was thick with a sense of waiting, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Something I had started, something I couldn't stop. I kept my eyes on the floor as I moved down the hallway, trying to avoid looking at the corners, at the spaces where the shadows seemed to twist and curl. The house had always been old, always had its quirks. The creaky floorboards, the drafty rooms, the smell of dampness that clung to the air. But now it was different. It was more than just old wood and settling beams. It was as though it had become a living thing, something that knew me, that knew what I had done. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, a heavy weight that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. I needed to find the door. The door the journal had warned me about. The door that had been opened long ago, unleashing whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. I moved cautiously through the house, my footsteps loud in the quiet. Each room I entered seemed colder than the last, the air growing thicker, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down on me like a physical weight. There was a room I hadn't explored yet. A small door at the end of the hallway, hidden behind a large, tattered tapestry. I had never paid much attention to it before, never thought to open it, but now something told me it was important. Something told me that the door I was looking for was behind that small, inconspicuous door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, the metal cold and slick beneath my fingers. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to know what was on the other side. But the pull was too strong, the need to understand too urgent. I twisted the knob and stepped inside. The room was small, a narrow, forgotten space that felt untouched by time. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, and the floorboards creaked beneath my weight as I stepped further into the room. At first, I thought it was just another storage room, boxes, old furniture, remnants of forgotten lives. But then I saw it. The door. It wasn't large, but it was imposing, standing out from the rest of the room like a wound in the wall, a deep black void that seemed to pull at my very soul. It was different from any other door in the house. No handles, no lock, just a dark, gaping space that seemed to be waiting for me. I couldn't look away. My eyes were drawn to it, my body frozen in place as the air grew colder, the silence more deafening. I could feel the presence again, that thing, whatever it was, lurking just beyond the door, just beyond the edge of my vision. It was in the room with me, I knew it. Watching. Waiting. I tried to turn away, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was stuck, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the door, the darkness within it swallowing everything around me. And then I heard it, a soft, dragging sound like something heavy moving across the floor. I spun around, my eyes wide, searching the room, but there was nothing there. Just the piles of old furniture, the forgotten objects of a life that had long since passed. But the sound, it was getting closer, closer. And then I felt it, a cold hand, icy and clammy, resting on my shoulder. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. No one. Just the empty room, the heavy silence pressing in from all sides. The door was still there though. Still open, still waiting. I could feel it now, the pull of it, the draw that made it impossible to look away, impossible to ignore. I stepped forward, my body moving on its own, as if I had no control over my own actions. The door seemed to grow larger as I approached it, the darkness within it deepening, spreading out like an all-consuming void. I reached for it, my hand trembling as it brushed the edge of the doorframe. And then the whispers came again. Louder this time, urgent, desperate. Finish it. You have to finish it. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I didn't know if I was still in control of my own body. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged in my ears, but it felt like it wasn't mine. It felt like someone else's. I stepped through the door. The world around me shifted instantly. One moment I was in the small room with the black door, and the next I was somewhere else entirely. I was still in the house, but it felt different. The walls were cracked, crumbling, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The floor was covered in dust and grime, but there was something more, something darker, something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The thing that had been waiting. It was here. The air on the other side of the door was different. It felt heavier, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had been soaked in darkness for years, centuries even. The walls around me seemed to pulse with an ancient rhythm, a slow, steady beat that echoed in my chest. I couldn't see where the noise was coming from, but I could feel it, deep within the bones of the house. I tried to step forward, but my feet felt as though they were stuck in place, as though the floor was made of tar. The weight of the air pushed down on me, making every movement a struggle, every breath harder to take. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure it could be heard across the house, but still, the silence around me was overwhelming. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, or what I assumed was the room. There were no windows, no doors. Just four walls, the air thick and cold, the floor covered in shadows that moved like something alive. I felt a chill creeping up my spine, and I instinctively pulled my arms closer to my body, as though it could protect me. I reached for the walls, my hands trembling as I touched them. The surface was damp, slick with something that didn't feel like water. It was more like oil. I wiped my fingers on my shirt, my skin crawling at the sensation. The smell in the air was worse now, thick and musty, a mixture of mold and decay, but underneath it all, something far darker lingered, a sour metallic stench that made my stomach turn. And then I heard it, a voice. Oh, hollow. Almost a whisper, but too distinct to ignore. You shouldn't have come here. I froze, my body rigid, my breath caught in my throat. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It was like it was all around me, swirling in the darkness, pressing in from every direction. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, constricted, as though I was choking on the very air itself. My hands gripped the wall harder, my nails digging into the cold surface as I tried to steady myself. I could feel the presence again. The thing that had been waiting, the one that had been following me from the moment I stepped into this house. It was here. It was close. Get out, the voice said again, its tone harsh now, rising in urgency. Before it's too late. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I had to leave. I didn't care what was happening or where I was. I needed to get back to the safety of the familiar, to the outside world, away from this nightmare. I spun around, desperate to find the door, but the space seemed to stretch, to warp. The room was changing before my eyes, its edges blurring, bending in unnatural ways, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. I took a step forward, but the floor was gone. The ground dropped out beneath me and I fell, falling endlessly into the darkness. My body slammed into the cold floor, the impact jarring my teeth and sending waves of pain through my body. I gasped for breath, my hands reaching out to grab something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the empty void surrounding me. The voice was louder now, closer. You shouldn't have opened the door, it said. Now you belong to it. Suddenly the room was no longer empty. Figures began to materialize out of the shadows, dark, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and shift, their forms flickering in and out of existence like they were part of the darkness itself. They were watching me, their eyes glowing in the gloom, their faces twisted in grotesque, hollow expressions. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away, my mind racing, desperate for a way out. The room was closing in on me, the walls pressing closer, the air growing even thicker, suffocating me. I could feel the weight of something pressing down on my chest, something unseen, something alive. I turned, my eyes darting frantically, searching for any sign of the door I had come through, the door I needed to find again. But there was nothing. Just the shapes in the shadows, the voices echoing around me, the darkness that seemed to swallow every trace of light. "You can't leave," the voice said, its tone now unmistakably mocking. "You're already here. You're already one of us." I tried to run. My legs moved, but they felt heavy, sluggish, as if the very ground beneath me was pulling me back. My breaths were shallow, my panic growing with every step, every sound. The figures in the shadows were moving now, closing in on me, their hollow eyes never leaving me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance, barely visible but enough to make my heart leap in my chest. The door. I ran toward it, my legs burning, my body screaming for relief, but the shadows were faster. They reached for me, their cold hands brushing against my skin, sending waves of ice through my veins. I could hear their voices too, whispers, laughter, promises of what would come next. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Or maybe it wasn't a door at all. Maybe it was just another trick of the house, another illusion to trap me here forever. "Let me out!" I screamed, my voice raw, desperate, but the shadows only laughed. They closed in, the cold hands grabbing at my arms, my legs pulling me back. I fought, kicking and screaming, but it was useless. I felt myself being dragged away from the door, deeper into the darkness as the voices echoed in my ears. "You're ours now." The door was gone. And then everything went black. I woke up, gasping for air, my heart thudding in my chest. The darkness was still there, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same suffocating blackness I had fallen into moments, or was it hours? Before. The air was thick, but it felt different now. I was no longer trapped in that nightmare, that place where the shadows and whispers had surrounded me. At least that's what I told myself. I blinked rapidly, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was morning, wasn't it? I could see the faint gray of the daylight filtering through the thin curtains in the room. My room. The house. The walls that felt as though they were closing in around me, but I was back in my own space. Or so I thought. But something was wrong. Something was deeply wrong. I stood up shakily, my legs weak beneath me. I reached for the wall to steady myself, my fingers brushing against the cold plaster. The familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet only made my stomach twist. I'd been here before, but now it felt like a stranger's home. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, that the house hadn't really shifted, that I hadn't gone through some unseen doorway into another world. But the cold knot in my gut told me that wasn't the truth. I moved toward the door, my fingers trembling as I grasped the handle. The sound of my breath echoed in the stillness of the room. I opened it slowly, stepping into the hallway. It was quiet, too quiet. The house was still. No sounds of creaking wood or faint whispers this time. Just silence. But the silence was worse. It felt like a warning. I walked slowly down the hall, my steps deliberate, my heart racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house before whatever had followed me in the night found me again. I had to leave before it was too late. I reached the front door. My hands shook as I gripped the handle, ready to twist it, ready to throw the door open and never look back. But before I could turn it, the door shuddered violently, as though something on the other side was pushing against it. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled my hand away from the handle, suddenly afraid to open the door. A cold wind seemed to seep through the cracks around it, carrying with it the faintest whispers, so soft I could barely hear them, but they were there, unmistakable. "You can't leave," the voice said, clearer this time, colder. "It's not over." I backed away from the door, my back hitting the wall behind me. I didn't know what was happening. Was this the house? Or was it me? My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, the voices, the darkness, the things I had seen. The shadowy figures, the whispering that had followed me through every step of this nightmare. They hadn't just been figments of my imagination. They had been real. And whatever they were still here. I turned toward the stairs, but before I could move, a noise came from upstairs, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. Heavy. As if someone, or something, was walking in the rooms above me. I froze. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I couldn't breathe. The floorboards groaned above me, followed by a loud, sudden bang as if something had fallen. Then another noise, scraping, dragging across the floor like something heavy was being pulled. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The house had always made sounds, settling, shifting, but this was different. This was deliberate. Then the whisper came again, louder now, more insistent, as though it were right beside me, as though it were coming from inside my head. You shouldn't have opened the door. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling of the words crawling under my skin. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to be here anymore. I had to leave. I turned and ran for the stairs, my feet pounding against the wood, my body moving on instinct, desperate to get out. But as I reached the first step, I froze. The hallway was no longer the same. The walls had changed. The once familiar plaster was now cracked, smeared with something that looked like dried blood, dark streaks running down the sides. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could hear faint whispers coming from the walls themselves, like the house was breathing, waiting for me to make my next move. I hesitated, staring at the twisted hallway, my body paralyzed with fear. The whispers were growing louder now, overwhelming, deafening. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I looked up, and there, at the top of the stairs, stood a figure. It was a woman, her face obscured by dark, tangled hair that hung around her like a shroud. Her clothes were old, tattered, as though she had been trapped here for years, maybe decades. She was standing perfectly still, watching me with eyes that seemed to burn through the darkness. The same eyes I had seen in my dreams. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was encased in cement, unable to react. I could only stare at her, the fear gripping me, tightening like a vice. She didn't move. She didn't speak again. But I could feel her eyes on me, burning with something ancient, something that wasn't human. And then, just like that, she was gone. I blinked, my vision blurry. The hallway was empty. But the house was different now. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I reached the door again, my hands shaking as I twisted the handle, throwing it open. I didn't wait to see what might be behind me. I didn't care. I ran into the yard, into the sunlight, away from the house, away from the terror that had followed me for so long. But as I ran, I could hear it. The whispers, the footsteps, the dragging sound just behind me. And as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it. The house, still standing, still waiting. And I knew deep in my soul that I would never truly escape it. I don't know how long I've been gone. Days, weeks, it doesn't matter. Time feels distorted now, like it no longer has any power over me. I left the house, but I didn't leave it behind. I thought running from it would solve everything, that if I got far enough away, the memories and the whispers would fade. But the truth is, they followed me. I couldn't escape the fear. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, something waiting for me to come back. The feeling of cold fingers creeping up my spine in the middle of the night. The soft murmurs like breath on the back of my neck. They were never gone. I tried to move on, to go back to a normal life. I rented an apartment in the city, far from the house. I started working again, meeting new people, pretending everything was fine. But the nightmares came every night. I could hear the footsteps, the dragging, and the whispers. And when I closed my eyes, I saw her, always there, standing at the top of the stairs, watching, waiting. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the house was just a memory now. But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger it became. The walls of my apartment began to creak. My door would slam shut for no reason. The lights would flicker just like in that house. And then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipping through the crack under my door as I sat at my kitchen table. It was thick, yellowed with age, and addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. My name was written in a flowing script, elegant but hurried, as though the writer had been in a rush. I tore it open without thinking. I had to know what it said. It was from a lawyer. Apparently, the house I had once rented, my house, was now legally mine. There had been no record of the previous owner, no heirs, nothing. The house had simply transferred to me. I stared at the letter, confusion settling in my chest. I had never signed anything. I hadn't even wanted the house. I had left it behind. But the document was real. The signature, the seals, it was all official. And then I saw the last sentence, scrawled at the bottom in thick, jagged handwriting that sent a chill down my spine. "You are now its keeper." The words echoed in my mind, twisting into a nightmare. I felt a sudden compulsion to go back, to return to the house. I didn't understand why, but something was calling me. It wasn't a choice. It felt as though I had no other option. I couldn't let it consume me. I told myself that I wasn't going back, that I had to let go. But the house wouldn't let me go. I found myself in my car the next morning, heading back to the town I had escaped from. The familiar road felt foreign now, like I was driving toward something I had no control over. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, the weight of the past pressing on my chest. The house loomed in the distance, just as I remembered it, standing tall against the gray sky. But it wasn't the same anymore. It looked darker, more menacing, like it had absorbed everything it had taken from me. I parked in front of the house, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I couldn't go inside. I couldn't face whatever was waiting for me in there. But I had no choice. Not anymore. I walked up the creaky steps, the wooden boards groaning under my feet, just like they had before. The door was ajar, as though it had been expecting me. I stepped inside. The house smelled the same, stale, damp, with a hint of something metallic like rust. The floorboards creaked as I made my way through the darkened hallway. But something was different now. The walls felt colder. The shadows seemed deeper. I moved toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was silent, too silent. And then I heard it, a low whisper coming from upstairs. "You shouldn't have come back." I froze, the words sending a cold shiver through my entire body. I knew that voice. I had heard it before. I slowly climbed the stairs, my feet dragging as though something was pulling me forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though I was sinking deeper into the house's grip. When I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, the rooms dark and still. I walked toward the bedroom at the end of the hall, where it had all started. The door was open, the room just as I had left it, unchanged. Except for one thing. In the center of the room was a mirror. A large, ornate mirror, its surface reflecting nothing but blackness. There was no light, no shape, just darkness. I stepped closer to it, my reflection slowly appearing, distorted and hazy. But there was something wrong with the reflection. It wasn't just me. In the mirror I saw her, the woman. Her face was just a blur, but her eyes. I could see her eyes clearly, staring right back at me. I felt a presence behind me and I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty, but the air had changed. It was thick now, suffocating. I felt something moving in the darkness, something waiting. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, but unmistakable. Coming from the mirror. They were mine, but they weren't. My heart raced as I backed away from the mirror, but it felt like the room itself was shifting around me. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing, curling around the edges of my vision. The whispers started again, louder this time. "You should have stayed away." I turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I reached the door, it slammed shut, the wood splintering as if something was trying to keep me inside. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but the whispers grew louder, more frantic. And then I heard it, her voice right behind me. "You're not leaving." I finally managed to wrench the door open, stepping out into the yard. The air felt cool against my skin and I glanced back at the house. It stood there, silent. But I knew that the house was never going to let me leave. It had already claimed me. I don't remember how I got back to my car. My mind was clouded with terror, my body trembling as though I were no longer in control of myself. I drove away from that house, away from the horror, but every mile that passed seemed to pull me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and lonely, but the house stayed with me. I could feel its cold, dark presence in the pit of my stomach, like a weight I couldn't shake. I could almost hear the whispers again, soft and persistent, curling around my thoughts. "You are its keeper." I shuddered, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to push the thought away. I had to keep going, had to get away. The town, the house, it was all behind me now. But I couldn't forget the feeling of the house, the sense of something following me, waiting for me to return. As I drove, the sky grew darker, the air colder. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the house behind me, looming in the distance. But all I saw was my own reflection, pale and haggard, eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a soft thud like something hitting the back of my car. My heart skipped a beat and I slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a stop. I turned around, scanning the empty road behind me, but there was nothing there. No other cars, no people. Just the silent stretch of asphalt under the fading light. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned forward again, my mind racing. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? And then I heard it. A faint sound like footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the back of the car. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare turn around again. I knew what would be waiting for me. I slammed the car into gear and drove off, my foot heavy on the pedal, pushing the car faster down the road. The footsteps kept pace, echoing in the back of my mind, louder now. I could almost feel the presence, that cold, suffocating force, pressing in around me. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of town that I dared to stop. I parked in a quiet, deserted lot, hoping to gather my bearings. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I don't know how long I sat there. Time seemed to bend, the world outside my car feeling distant, disconnected. But then a noise, a soft scratching at the window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like something, or someone, was trying to get in. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned my head toward the window. I saw her reflection. She was standing there, her face pale, her eyes hollow and dark. Her mouth opened, and though there was no sound, I could hear her voice in my mind. "You should have stayed." The words echoed in my ears, filling my head with an unbearable pressure. My vision blurred as I fought to tear my gaze away. I slammed my hands over my ears, but her voice wouldn't stop. It was inside me now. Asterisk, you are the keeper. You can't escape, asterisk. In a panic, I started the car again and sped off, not caring where I was going, not caring about anything except the need to run. But I knew deep down there was no running from it. I could feel the house now, even from a distance. I could feel its cold grasp tightening around me. It had already marked me. The curse had claimed me. I don't know how long I drove or where I went. My thoughts were a blur, the road a winding, endless path. And every now and then, through the corner of my eye, I would see her. Just a flash, a silhouette in the distance. But when I looked directly, she was gone. Eventually, I pulled over again, this time on a quiet street far from town. The sky was dark now, the moon hidden behind clouds. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaky, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there in the street, staring into the night, wondering if I would ever feel safe again. And then I heard it. A faint sound just on the edge of hearing. The sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming closer. I turned, but there was no one there. And yet, the footsteps continued, louder now, as if someone, or something, was walking right behind me. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. But the footsteps followed. I don't know what happened next. Did I fall asleep? Did I lose my mind? All I know is that when I woke up, I was back at the house. I don't know how I got here. The car's still parked out front, but I can't move. I feel the weight of the house pressing in, its walls closing around me. The whispers are louder now, more insistent. You are the keeper. I hear her footsteps. And I know that there's no escape now. The house has me. And soon it will have someone else. Story 2. It had been 3 weeks since I moved into the old house on Willow Street. The kind of house people would describe as creaky or charming, but mostly I found it to be a strange, unsettling place. It wasn't the house itself that bothered me though. I had been through enough recently to know that a fresh start was exactly what I needed. New city, new job, new home. But somehow, it felt like the house had its own personality, one I wasn't sure I could quite grasp. The first time I stepped inside, it had that old house smell, musty like the walls themselves were absorbing years of history. Dust floated in the air like ghosts, settling on every surface, and the creaky floors seemed to groan beneath every step, as though they were complaining about the weight of another person disturbing their long-standing silence. I figured it was just the age of the place. Wooden houses like this always settled and made noise, right? I had just gone through a divorce, and leaving behind my old life was supposed to be liberating. But nothing about this house felt liberating. It was too quiet at night. The kind of silence that made you second-guess yourself. And the house, well, it had quirks. The floorboards didn't just creak, they moaned. The back door didn't shut properly, no matter how hard I slammed it, and sometimes I'd find a light flickering, even though I was certain I hadn't touched the switch. After a few days of settling in, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, an elderly woman who seemed to know everything about everyone in the neighborhood. She came over one afternoon to introduce herself, bringing with her a pot of soup and a stack of gossip. She mentioned that she'd lived on Willow Street for decades and had seen plenty of tenants come and go. Funny thing about this house, she said with a conspiratorial smile. You're not the first one to feel like it's, well, haunted. She paused, her eyes flickering toward the window, as though she were checking to see if anyone else was listening. The last tenant, poor thing, ran out of here in the middle of the night, screaming about curses and something she couldn't explain. She wouldn't even come back for her stuff. I remember laughing it off, but her expression didn't change. She said she kept hearing things at night. Footsteps, whispering, things moving when no one was there. I'd stay clear of the attic if I were you. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she glanced up at the house behind me as though it might be listening. But, people do say strange things about this place. I smiled politely, but the mention of the attic caught my attention. There was something about it that seemed off. The door to it was tucked away at the end of the hallway, an old wooden door with a rusty handle that I couldn't quite turn. Mrs. Whitaker's words stayed with me, though. A curse? Footsteps at night? I didn't believe in that kind of thing, at least not anymore. My life had been full of enough surprises for one lifetime, and a haunted house just wasn't something I was ready to deal with. The first few nights were fine. I would stay up late, watching TV or scrolling mindlessly on my phone. The house creaked, sure, but that was to be expected. A bit of groaning from the floorboards, the occasional thump that sounded like something had fallen in the next room, but nothing that made me feel truly uncomfortable. It was just an old house. The kind that had been standing for decades, maybe longer. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, a few nights in, I started hearing the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. The floorboards were old, and it wasn't unusual for them to make noise. But these footsteps, they didn't sound like they were coming from the walls or the floor. They sounded like they were coming from upstairs, pacing back and forth, slow and deliberate. It was late, around 2 a.m. when I first heard them. The steps were heavy, as if someone was walking through the hallway above me, dragging their feet along the floor. I told myself it was the wind or maybe even a neighbor walking through their own creaky old house. But I could hear the distinct sound of each step, one after the other, without pause, and they didn't stop. They just kept going. I lay in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was imagining it. My mind started to play tricks on me, making every little noise seem more ominous. The creak of the floorboards, the wind tapping at the windows, was it all just part of the house settling? Or was it something else? The next morning, I mentioned it to Mrs. Whitaker, half joking, half serious. "You weren't kidding about the footsteps," I said, watching her face carefully for any sign of recognition. She smiled softly, but there was something in her eyes, something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're hearing them too, are you? Funny how these things start up when you're alone. It's always when you're alone." She left it at that, and I couldn't help but feel a chill as I closed the door behind her. Was she trying to warn me? Or had she heard those footsteps herself? The rest of the day went by in a blur of normalcy. I unpacked a few more boxes, set up the couch, and tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that seemed to cling to me. But when night came and the house settled into its usual creaks and groans, I couldn't escape the sense that something was waiting. That night, the footsteps returned. Only this time they were louder. This time they were closer. And this time they didn't stop. The footsteps kept me up all night, my heart racing as I listened, hoping, praying, that they would stop. But they didn't. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the sweat gather on the back of my neck, the oppressive silence of the house wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. The sound of slow, deliberate steps pacing across the floor above was maddening. It was as if someone was walking just out of sight, waiting for me to do something, to make the next move. By morning, the noise had faded. The house was eerily quiet again, almost as if nothing had happened at all. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I had somehow conjured the sounds in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the day trying to keep myself busy. I organized my things, fixed up the garden a bit, anything to distract myself from the growing unease that seemed to be settling in my chest. But every time I glanced at the staircase leading up to the second floor, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me. The house felt like it was alive, breathing, waiting for me to make a mistake. That night, the footsteps returned. But this time it was different. I had just finished dinner when I heard them again, slow, heavy, deliberate. But now they weren't just in the hallway above. They were in the room next to mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound of footsteps shuffling on the floor was unmistakable. The floorboards were creaking beneath the weight of whoever, or whatever, was walking around. I glanced toward the door to my bedroom. It was open, the dark hallway stretching out in front of me, and I could swear I saw a shadow move past the corner of my vision. My heart thudded painfully against my ribcage as I slowly stood, creeping toward the source of the sound. The hallway was empty, but the air in the house had changed, become colder. Much colder than usual. I reached out to touch the door frame, my fingers brushing the wood, and a chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't just stand there anymore. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made my way up the creaky stairs, the light cutting through the darkness. The beams of light flickered, and I could hear the house groaning beneath my feet. The top of the stairs was shrouded in shadow, and the only sound was the thumping of my heart in my chest. When I reached the second floor, I felt a strange, uncomfortable sensation wash over me. The air felt thicker here, almost oppressive. The house seemed to press in on me from all sides. The floorboards creaked louder than ever, and the odd smell of mildew seemed to grow stronger as I moved down the hall toward the door to the attic. I didn't want to go in there. There was something about that door, something that made me feel like I shouldn't be there. But I had to know what was going on. I had to find out if there was some logical explanation for the noises, for the things I had been hearing. I reached out to open the attic door, and just as my fingers brushed the handle, I heard it, footsteps unmistakably real and loud right behind me. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat, but the hallway was empty. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it, my mind playing tricks on me. But then, just beyond the stairs, I saw it, a figure. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the end of the hallway, almost as if it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I gasped and stepped back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The shadow didn't move, just stood there watching me. And then, slowly, it began to fade, dissolving into the air like smoke. I backed away, my legs shaking beneath me. My body was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood frozen in place for what felt like an eternity, until I finally found the courage to turn and flee downstairs. I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent hours staring out the window, watching the moonlight spill across the yard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't feel real, but the fear in my chest said otherwise. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. I couldn't just keep pretending that everything was fine. The house had a history and I needed to know more. Mrs. Whitaker had mentioned something about the house's past, about the tenants who had lived here before me. Maybe they had experienced something similar. Maybe they knew more about the strange things that were happening. I knocked on her door just as the sun began to set, hoping she might have some insight. She opened it with a tired smile, but there was something different in her eyes this time, something darker. "Is something wrong, dear?" she asked, her voice low, almost as if she knew why I was there. I heard something last night," I stammered, trying to gather my thoughts. "Footsteps, and I saw a shadow. I don't know if I'm just imagining it, but I need to know more about this house. About its history." Her face grew pale at the mention of the shadow, and she stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. The door creaked shut behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something much bigger than I had anticipated. "You're not the first one," Mrs. Whitaker said quietly, sitting down across from me. "I told you this house had a reputation. People who've lived here before, they've seen things. And I think it's time you knew the truth." She paused for a moment, her eyes drifting to the floor. "This house was once owned by a man named Charles Crawford. He was a peculiar man obsessed with the occult. People say he used to perform rituals here, strange ceremonies in the dead of night. No one really knows what he was trying to do, but they say he was trying to open a door to something that shouldn't be messed with." Her words hung in the air like a fog, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "What happened to him?" I whispered. "He disappeared," Mrs. Whitaker replied softly. "One night he was just gone. No one ever saw him again. But after that, things started to change around here. People started hearing things, seeing things. The house, well, it hasn't been the same since." I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. A man obsessed with the occult? Rituals? I had to know more. I had to understand what I was dealing with, and whether I was truly alone in this house, or if something was waiting for me in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Whitaker wasn't telling me everything. There was something in her eyes when she spoke about Charles Crawford, a fear that hadn't been there before. It made my skin crawl. I had to know more. I had to understand what had really happened in this house, what kind of door Crawford had tried to open, and why it felt like something was still here, waiting. Later that night, I sat on the floor of the living room, a flashlight beside me and a heavy old book in my lap. I had spent the evening searching through the house, from the attic to the basement, hoping to find something that could explain the strange occurrences. In the attic, I had found a dusty box tucked away in the corner. Inside were old papers, yellowed with age, and among them was a journal that had the name Charles Crawford scrawled across the front in faded ink. I flipped through the pages, each one filled with strange, cryptic notes and diagrams. Words like ritual, sacrifice, and opening the threshold jumped off the page, sending a chill through me. The further I read, the more I realized how deep Crawford's obsession with the occult had gone. He had written about performing rituals to communicate with something from the other side. He spoke of using the house as a vessel, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead could be blurred. I turned a page and my breath caught in my throat. There, in the center of the page, was a drawing. It wasn't a symbol I recognized, but something about it made my stomach twist. It was a diagram of the house, my house, and at the center of the floor plan, there was a marked X, with a note written underneath it. Where the door is weakest, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know what it meant, but something deep inside me told me I wasn't supposed to. I kept reading, more and more desperate to find an answer, but the words grew more frantic as Crawford's handwriting became more erratic. At the end of the journal, there was a final entry that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, it is coming. The door is open. There is no way back now. Asterisk. I snapped the book shut, my heart pounding. What did it mean? What door had Crawford opened? And was it still open? I placed the journal back in the box and decided I needed some air. I couldn't think straight in the oppressive silence of the house. I needed to clear my head to figure out what to do next. As I stood and walked toward the front door, I noticed a shadow flickering in the corner of my eye. I froze. I glanced toward the window, but nothing was there. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I opened the door and stepped outside, the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like the weight of the house was pressing down on me. I looked around the yard, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves, but something was off. There was no wind, no movement. It was as if the entire world had stopped, holding its breath. I walked around the side of the house, pacing, trying to make sense of everything. As I neared the back door, I heard something, a faint noise like someone whispering my name. I spun around, but again there was nothing. No one. I couldn't breathe, my chest tightening as I looked into the darkness of the yard. Stop it, I muttered to myself, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was here. Something was watching me. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. The house felt more oppressive now, like it was closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Crawford had done had left something behind. A presence, a thing that had been waiting in the shadows for years, maybe even centuries. As the night wore on, the house seemed to grow colder. The creaking floorboards above me sounded louder than ever, like footsteps, heavy, purposeful. I gripped the edge of the couch, trying to steady myself as the sounds grew closer, until I was certain they were right above me. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to find out what was causing the noises. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam of light shook in my hand as I moved down the hallway. The air felt thick, as if I were walking through something solid. Every footstep I took felt like it echoed through the house, like it was reverberating off the walls. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it, the door to the attic. It was cracked open, just enough for a sliver of light to spill out into the dark hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped toward it, the beam of my flashlight flickering in and out. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. As I stepped inside, the air turned frigid, like I had crossed into another world. The attic was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering flashlight in my hand. Boxes and old furniture were stacked haphazardly around the room, but what caught my eye was a large, ornate mirror standing against the far wall. The mirror was old, its frame covered in intricate carvings. The glass was cloudy, reflecting a distorted version of the room. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got to the mirror, the more I felt something pulling at me, like an invisible force tugging at my very soul. And then I saw it. A figure standing behind me in the reflection. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The attic was empty, just as it had been moments before. But the mirror, the reflection was still there. The figure behind me was still standing, motionless. I stepped back, the flashlight falling from my hand, my breath shallow. The figure in the mirror didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared at me, a dark shape in the reflection. And then the figure smiled. It was a smile that didn't belong to a human being. A twisted, cruel grin that sent terror coursing through my veins. I turned and fled from the attic, my legs shaking so badly that I nearly collapsed on the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was back in the living room, panting, my body drenched in sweat. The house felt like it was alive, like it was closing in on me from all sides. And I knew with a sickening certainty that whatever Crawford had unleashed was still here. It wasn't just haunting the house, it was waiting for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back from the attic. The mirror, that figure, whatever it was, it felt like it had reached out and touched me. I could feel it, lingering in the back of my mind, a dark presence that wouldn't let go. My body was trembling and my head was spinning as I sat on the couch, trying to calm my nerves. But I knew, deep down, that whatever I had seen wasn't just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. It was real. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it had ever ticked before, each passing second feeling like a warning. The house was silent now, too silent, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my next move. I tried to focus on something else, anything else, to distract myself from the unease that was clawing at me. But the sounds, the strange creaks and groans kept coming back. They weren't random, not anymore. They were deliberate. I glanced toward the kitchen, where a cold draft seemed to be creeping in from the cracks in the window. The air smelled faintly of something rotten. I couldn't tell if it was the house settling or something more sinister. My throat tightened and I swallowed hard. Maybe it was time to leave, to pack up and get out while I still could. But I couldn't. Something was keeping me here. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I had to face whatever was haunting this place. Just then there was a knock at the door. I froze. Who could it be at this hour? I hadn't seen anyone around since I moved in. Hesitantly, I stood and walked toward the door, my heart racing in my chest. As I reached for the handle, I felt a chill sweep through the air and I pulled my hand back instinctively. My breath hitched in my throat as I pressed my ear to the door. I could hear nothing, just the soft hum of silence. I opened the door slowly, my eyes scanning the yard, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, glancing around, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on me. The street was empty, the houses all dark. The sound of distant wind howling echoed in the night. I frowned, wondering if I had imagined the knock, but as I turned to head back inside, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The porch light flickered, and in the reflection on the glass, I saw the figure again, the same figure from the mirror. It was standing in the doorway just behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my thoughts raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to figure out what Crawford had done, what curse he had set into motion. The journal, the mirror, the footsteps. It was all connected. But how? Suddenly, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were coming from upstairs, but they weren't just a random creak of the house. These were heavy, deliberate steps, as though someone was walking down the hall. I froze, my body tense with fear. It was impossible. There was no one up there. But the sound was unmistakable, getting closer, closer. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking, and slowly crept toward the stairs. The house was so quiet now, it was suffocating. Each step I took seemed to echo through the empty rooms, a loud, harsh sound in the oppressive silence. My mind raced with every possibility. What if it was Crawford or whatever he had summoned? What if I was already too late? I reached the top of the stairs, my legs unsteady beneath me, and I paused. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. The hallway stretched out before me, and at the far end, I could just make out the open door to the master bedroom. It was faintly lit, the glow from the streetlight casting eerie shadows through the window. My stomach twisted as I moved toward it, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air was colder now, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, deliberate breaths coming from inside the room. It was a sound that didn't belong. My heart hammered in my chest as I pushed the door open. The room was empty. But the bed was different. The covers were pulled back as if someone had been sitting there. And then I saw it, a figure sitting on the edge of the bed, its back turned toward me. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, thin, and impossibly still. The room was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of the curtains as the wind picked up outside. I took a step forward, my legs trembling, but the figure didn't move. It didn't acknowledge me at all. Who are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned its head toward me and I froze. The face was blank, featureless, just a smooth, pale surface. The eyes were two dark voids, empty and endless, staring right through me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't stay there anymore. I ran as fast as I could, back down the stairs and out of the house. The air outside was cold, but it didn't matter. I had to get away. I didn't know how long I had been running, but eventually I found myself standing in front of the house, panting, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The lights in the windows flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw the figure in the window watching me, but I couldn't be sure. My vision blurred as tears welled in my eyes, and I turned away, determined not to look back. I drove away, not even sure where I was going. I just needed to be far from that house, from whatever had been waiting for me inside. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever had haunted that house, whatever Crawford had unleashed, was still out there, still watching. And then, as I rounded a bend in the road, I heard it again. the footsteps, faint but unmistakable, following me. The drive was a blur. My hands were clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles white as my mind replayed every moment from the house. The figure on the bed, those dark, empty eyes, it was all too much. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the back seat, but nothing was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The road stretched out before me, the headlights illuminating the dark, empty highway. I wanted to escape, to put miles between myself and that cursed house, but I felt like it was following me, its grip on my mind tightening with each passing mile. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Was it all in my head? Or had something truly come back with me from that place? I glanced at the clock, almost 3 in the morning. My eyes were heavy, and the exhaustion was starting to catch up with me. I pulled into a small gas station, the flickering neon lights casting a sickly glow over the pavement. The place was quiet, abandoned almost, except for the lone attendant behind the counter, who looked up with a bored expression when I entered. "Long night?" he asked, his voice low and disinterested. I didn't respond at first, too focused on trying to ground myself. I didn't want to think about the house or the things I had seen, but I couldn't escape it. It was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. "Yeah," I muttered, finally managing to tear my gaze away from the door. "You could say that." He didn't say anything else, just turned back to his work, fiddling with a set of keys. I bought a bottle of water and left quickly, eager to get back on the road. But as I stepped outside, the cold air hit me, sharp and biting, and I felt that unsettling sensation again, that someone was watching. I hurried back to the car, locking the doors as soon as I slid inside. The headlights cast long shadows over the empty gas station, the dark corners of the lot seeming to stretch forever. I was about to start the engine when I saw it, movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure. It was just standing there at the edge of the parking lot near the trees. A tall silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. My pulse quickened as I squinted, trying to make out any details. But there was nothing. No face, no distinguishing features, just a shape. And the worst part? It was staring directly at me. I didn't wait to see if it would move closer. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and sped off, leaving the gas station behind in a cloud of dust. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let it follow me. It was too much. The fear, the paranoia, it was suffocating. The road wound through dense forest, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. No sign of the figure. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. And then, just as I thought I might be able to calm down, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were clearer, louder. I felt them vibrating through the car as if something was right behind me, pacing alongside the vehicle. My heart raced as I pressed the pedal harder, pushing the car faster, but the footsteps kept matching my speed, always a step behind. I looked in the mirror once more and my blood ran cold. There, just beyond the headlights in the rear view, I saw the figure. It was moving too fast, running alongside the car, keeping pace with me. I screamed and swerved the wheel, nearly losing control of the car as I tried to shake it off. The figure didn't stop. It was there, always in the reflection, always behind me. I didn't know how long I drove, but eventually the exhaustion caught up with me. My vision blurred and my eyelids grew heavy. I couldn't think straight. I just needed to stop. Just for a moment. I found a small motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting an eerie red glow over the parking lot. It seemed like the kind of place where strange things happen, but at that moment I didn't care. I was too tired to drive any further. I needed a break, a chance to breathe. The clerk at the desk didn't ask questions, just handed me a key, and I took the stairs to my room in a daze. The room smelled faintly of mildew and the carpet was threadbare, but it was a place to rest. I locked the door behind me and dropped my bag on the bed, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure again. The face, those empty eyes staring at me from the darkness. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of the house, the journal, the curse. Had I unleashed something? Or had it always been there, waiting for someone to step into its path? I don't know how long I lay there, wide-eyed, listening to the sound of my own breath, but I eventually managed to doze off, only to be jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were coming from outside my room. Slow, deliberate steps. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, unable to move, unable to make a sound. The footsteps stopped right outside and then silence. But I knew it wasn't over. And it was only a matter of time before whatever had haunted that house found its way to me. The silence in the motel room was deafening. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in around me. I stared at the door, my body frozen in place, every muscle tense, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew better than to think I was safe. Whatever had been following me, whatever had been haunting that house, was still out there, still watching. I slowly rose from the bed, my feet cold against the thin carpet. The room felt smaller now, the shadows darker. My hand shook as I reached for the lamp, flicking it on. The sudden light made the room feel too bright, too exposed, but I couldn't stand the dark anymore. Not with the footsteps, not with the fear gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I walked to the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The knob was cold when I touched it, and for a moment I thought about opening it. What if it was just the wind? What if my mind was playing tricks on me again? But I couldn't shake the feeling, the gut-wrenching certainty that something was out there, something that had followed me from the house, from the attic, from the mirror. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. At first, all I could hear was the hum of the motel's old air conditioning unit and the distant sound of cars on the highway. But then, just below that, I heard it. A low, slow breathing, almost like a whisper. It wasn't just the wind. I stepped back from the door, my breath shallow. I didn't know what to do. There was no one around. No one to help. I was alone, and whatever was out there knew it. The fear I felt in that moment was suffocating. The kind of fear that paralyzes you, makes you doubt everything you've ever believed. I stumbled back to the bed, my head spinning. My eyes were wide, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, trying to dial a number, any number, but my fingers felt clumsy, like they weren't my own. I had no one to call. Not here. Not now. I could barely even remember where I was, what I was doing, why I'd left the house. I only knew one thing: I couldn't go back. I glanced at the window, trying to steady my breath. The streetlights outside cast an eerie glow across the parking lot. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing near one of the shadows, watching me. But when I looked again, it was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was still on edge from everything that had happened in that house. But deep down, I knew. I knew it wasn't just my mind. I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer, slower. I bolted from the bed, my legs nearly giving out from under me as I scrambled toward the window. I yanked the blinds open, half expecting to see something, someone standing right outside watching me. But there was nothing. The parking lot was empty, the shadows long and dark. Nothing moved. Nothing but the wind. But I couldn't relax. The breathing, it was getting louder. Closer. I whirled around to face the door, my heart racing. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to run, but I didn't know where I would go. I didn't know what was following me or why. All I knew was that it wasn't going to stop. The doorknob turned. I froze. The door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, and I could feel the coldness rush in, a chill that seeped into my bones. The air smelled strange, like something rotten, something ancient. My eyes darted toward the crack in the door, heart pounding in my chest, ready to run, but unable to move. The fear was too overwhelming. Then I saw it. The figure. It was standing just outside the door, bathed in the faint light from the hallway. It was tall, too tall, and thin, its form barely visible in the darkness. The air around it seemed to ripple, as if it wasn't fully part of this world. Its face, if you could call it a face, was smooth, featureless, like a blank canvas. But there were eyes. Dark, hollow eyes that stared directly into mine. The footsteps had stopped. The breathing was gone. Only the figure remained. My throat tightened. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was here. It had followed me. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt its presence like a weight on my chest, pressing down, suffocating me. I couldn't look away, couldn't bring myself to run. I was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of something I couldn't comprehend. Then it spoke. Not with words, but with a sound, a low, guttural hum that reverberated through the room, rattling the walls and shaking the air. It was the sound of something ancient, something not meant to be heard by human ears. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my voice lost. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and I felt something cold and damp brush against my skin, like fingers, but not quite. The figure took a step forward, and I recoiled, my body finally responding, my feet moving before I could think. I stumbled backward, tripping over the bed, and fell to the floor with a hard thud. My breath was ragged, panicked as I crawled toward the door. I had to get out. I had to escape. But before I could reach the door, the figure was there, standing between me and the exit. It was blocking me in. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make it stop. But I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't let it touch me, couldn't let it. The figure raised a hand and I felt a sharp, icy sensation grip my chest. And then everything went black. I woke up in the car. I don't know how I got there. I don't know how long I was unconscious. But I was back on the road, the engine running, the headlights cutting through the dark. My hands were gripping the wheel again, but I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Was I still dreaming? Had I ever left that motel room? The figure wasn't with me. Not physically. But its presence was there, in the back of my mind, in the cold air around me. I glanced in the rearview mirror. And for a moment, just a brief moment, I thought I saw its eyes staring back at me from the darkness. It was still following me. I didn't stop driving. I couldn't. It felt like the road stretched on endlessly before me, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't outrun the fear that clung to me like a second skin. The figure, the coldness, the eerie silence, it all haunted me, lurking just outside the edges of my thoughts. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those hollow, featureless eyes staring back at me. But the mirror was empty, the night road stretching behind me like a dark tunnel. But that didn't make me feel safe. Every mile I drove, every passing streetlight, every stretch of empty highway only seemed to amplify the unease that had taken root in my chest. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of distant crickets. I rolled the windows down, hoping the cool night air would clear my head, but it didn't help. The smell of old wood and dust clung to my clothes, a reminder of the house I had left behind, a reminder of the curse. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All that mattered was getting as far from that place as possible. But the more I drove, the more I realized something. I wasn't getting away. Not really. The road might stretch on forever, but the house, it was still with me. That old house, with its creaking floorboards and twisted history, had a grip on me. And now I was starting to believe it had never truly let go. I didn't remember falling asleep, but the next thing I knew, the sun was rising. A pale, weak light bled into the car through the windshield, casting long shadows across the dashboard. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess, but my body felt heavy, exhausted. As I blinked, trying to focus, the world outside the car came into view. A stretch of forest, the trees tall and thick, their shadows creeping over the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The road curved ahead, and I glanced out the window, hoping to see a sign for a town, anything that might give me a sense of direction. But there was nothing. Just trees stretching on endlessly, surrounding me, closing me in. It felt like the road itself was moving, pulling me deeper into the woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain why, but something about this road, about the way the trees seemed to press in on either side, made my pulse quicken. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent a chill down my spine. And then it happened. The first sound. A faint tapping. Soft at first, like a distant knock. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. My grip tightened on the wheel. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing. No cars behind me, no headlights. Just the empty road. It came again. A tap, tap, tap. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as my eyes darted around the car, trying to locate the source of the noise. It wasn't coming from behind me, it was coming from inside the car. I turned to my left, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. There, on the passenger seat, was something I hadn't noticed before. A small, leather-bound book. It wasn't mine. I didn't remember seeing it there when I had first started the car, and yet there it was, lying innocently beside me. The tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. I reached for the book, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The cover was old, worn, the edges frayed. It felt heavy in my hands, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I opened the cover, my eyes scanning the first page, but the words were barely legible. A series of symbols, strange, twisted markings, covered the pages as though someone had written them in a frantic, hasty hand. I flipped through the pages, the eerie silence around me broken only by the rhythmic tapping, which had now grown louder, more insistent. Then I found it. A page that was different from the rest. The symbols stopped, replaced by words in a language I didn't recognize. But it wasn't the language that terrified me, it was the feeling it gave me. The sense that this was something far older, far darker than anything I had ever known. I couldn't stop reading. My eyes were drawn to the words, my mind desperate to understand, even as it screamed at me to stop. The words began to twist, to shift on the page as if they were alive, moving in a slow, serpentine crawl. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, creeping outward like ice spreading through my veins. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't pull my gaze from the page, from the text that was somehow drawing me deeper into its dark embrace. And then the words became clearer, more distinct. "They are watching," I read aloud, my voice trembling. "They are waiting." The tapping stopped. I looked up, my heart pounding. For the first time since I had found the book, I felt the air grow still. The world outside the car seemed to hold its breath, the forest around me silent. Then I heard it, a whisper. It wasn't coming from the car. It wasn't coming from anywhere I could see, but it was there, in my mind, in my ears. "Turn around." The voice was low, ragged, like it had been dragged through the dirt. But it was clear, unmistakable. I didn't have to look to know that the woods were no longer empty. The trees were not empty. The shadows weren't shadows anymore. They were waiting. The tapping started again, this time louder, frantic, as if the source of it was right next to me. I threw the book down in a panic, and it landed with a soft thud on the passenger seat. The whisper echoed in my mind. "Turn around." I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward. The trees blurred by as I sped down the road, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror again. But this time something was different. There was a figure standing in the road, just at the edge of the trees. I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, my heart in my throat as I stared at the figure in the mirror. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct but undeniably there. My breath caught in my throat and I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure turned slowly, its face just out of view, but I could feel its eyes on me. And then, without warning, it vanished. The road ahead of me was empty, silent. But I could feel the presence, the weight of something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something that had followed me just as I had feared. I couldn't stay on the road. I couldn't stay in this town. I had to get out. I slammed the car back into gear and sped off, the figure fading into the distance behind me. But I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. I wasn't free. I would never be free. The days that followed were a blur, an endless spiral of fear and paranoia. I couldn't go back to the house. I couldn't go anywhere near that cursed place. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, the shadow in the trees, its cold eyes burning into my mind. The whisper, "Turn around," replayed over and over in my thoughts, each time sharper, more insistent. I left the car parked in a dimly lit lot on the edge of town and walked the rest of the way to the motel. I didn't want to be near any familiar places, not even the spot where I had parked the car. The motel was a small, dingy place at the edge of town, quiet and almost deserted. A safe haven, I thought, where I could forget for a little while. But as the days passed, I realized there was no forgetting. The nightmares started the first night I stayed there. At first, they were just flashes, fragments of images, a jumble of half-formed faces, and the sound of footsteps. But as the nights wore on, the dreams grew more vivid, more real. The figure, the one I had seen on the road, appeared in every dream. It stood in the corner of the room, its shape blurry and undefined. But I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I woke up every morning drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The fear was so real that I could still hear the whisper in my ears, even after I opened my eyes. It wasn't just the nightmares, though. The strange occurrences followed me no matter where I went. I would hear the tapping, soft and insistent, coming from the walls, the floor, or even the ceiling of my motel room. Sometimes I thought I heard a voice, faint, distant, but undeniably there. I tried to dismiss it, tried to convince myself it was just the sound of the building settling, but deep down, I knew better. And then came the night when everything changed. It was late, around midnight. The tapping had been louder that evening, as if something, or someone, was pacing around the room, circling me, waiting for the right moment. I sat up in bed, staring at the door, my breath shallow, my body tense. I knew it was coming. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't have to wait long. The door creaked open slowly, as if pushed by an unseen hand. My heart leaped into my throat and I froze, unable to move. I knew I should have run. I knew I should have screamed, but I was paralyzed by fear, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't the same shadow from the woods. No, this one was different. More solid, more real, and yet still impossible to fully see. It was tall, towering over the doorframe, its face hidden in the darkness. But there was something unmistakably wrong about it, the way it moved, the way it seemed to breathe. It was unnatural, and the air around it grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath in the room. The tapping had stopped. The silence was suffocating, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. The figure stepped forward, slowly, almost casually, as if it had all the time in the world. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs were frozen in place, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure as it crossed the threshold and stepped into the room. It was only when it reached the foot of the bed that it spoke. A whisper. "Turn around." The words were like a blade cutting through the air. I didn't know how I knew, but I felt its eyes on me, burning through the darkness. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, suffocating. I tried to move, tried to scramble backward, but my limbs were frozen. The figure didn't move closer. It just stood there watching, waiting. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My voice was lost, stolen by the silence that hung heavy in the air. I could feel the weight of its gaze, and I knew it wasn't just watching me. It was studying me, waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned. It walked away, its footsteps fading into the distance, but the presence remained. It lingered in the room, pressing against me, suffocating me with its coldness. I tried to breathe, but it felt like the air was being stolen from my lungs. I don't know how long I lay there, trembling in the dark. All I could do was stare at the door, waiting for it to open again. But it didn't. The silence was thick, suffocating, and the fear gnawed at me like a living thing. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I gathered my things in a daze, not even bothering to check out. I didn't care. I didn't care about anything anymore except getting away from that place, from the thing that was hunting me. I walked out into the morning light, but it didn't help. The sun didn't chase away the darkness. I could still feel it, that presence, hovering just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. I thought I could outrun it, leave it all behind, but the truth was I couldn't escape it. Not the figure, not the curse, not the house. It had already claimed me. And no matter how far I went, no matter where I ran, it would follow. Because it wasn't just in the house anymore. It was inside me, whispering, waiting. And there was nowhere left to hide. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was just imagining things. It had to be that. That I had finally cracked from the stress, the isolation, the fear. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had never been more awake, more alert, more aware of the creeping dread that followed me everywhere I went. I ended up back in town, back where it all started. I tried to avoid the house, but it was impossible. It pulled at me like a magnet, a dark, twisted force that wouldn't let me go. Every time I drove by, I felt my stomach twist into knots. I couldn't help it. My curiosity had gotten the better of me. Something inside me told me I had to know. What was it that was haunting me? What had been unleashed in that house? I couldn't stop myself. I found myself at the local library the next morning, combing through old records and newspapers, desperate for any clue, any shred of information about the house and its previous inhabitants. The librarian, a woman in her late 50s with graying hair and thick glasses, didn't seem surprised to see me. She had that look in her eyes, the kind you get when you know something terrible is coming but you don't want to acknowledge it. She didn't ask why I was there. She just nodded as if she had been expecting me all along. Looking for something specific? She asked, her voice soft but laced with a quiet warning. I hesitated. The house on Ashford Road. Do you know anything about it? The librarian's eyes flickered for a moment, then she looked around, making sure no one else was near. You're not the first one to come looking, she murmured. It's not a place you want to dig into? I frowned. What do you mean? She sighed and pulled a dusty folder from behind the counter. A lot of strange things have happened there over the years. People have come and gone, but no one stays for long. No one who's lived there has ever left the same. It's cursed, you know. The original owner, he was obsessed with the occult. Did things, strange things. Rituals. People say he opened a door, but what came through wasn't something you want to know about. I took the folder from her hands, my pulse racing. I didn't know what I expected to find, but as I opened it, a chill crawled up my spine. The papers inside were yellowed with age, the edges frayed as though they had been handled many times over the years. The first document was a police report from decades ago. It was filled with details about the disappearance of the house's original owner, William Hollis. The report told a story of a man who had been reclusive, spending years in isolation after his wife's sudden death. He had become obsessed with dark rituals, searching for ways to communicate with the dead. Neighbors had reported strange lights and sounds coming from the house at night. One night, a neighbor claimed to have seen Hollis performing some kind of ritual in the yard, surrounded by symbols drawn in the dirt. The report ended abruptly, with no further explanation of what had happened to Hollis. It seemed the man had simply vanished, leaving behind an empty house and a town full of rumors. I turned the page, my hands trembling. There were more police reports, a few mentions of strange happenings, of people running from the house in fear, babbling incoherently about curses, about being followed by something they couldn't explain. And then there was the most recent entry, a report of a woman who had moved into the house just a year before me. Her name was Emily Hayes, and according to the report, she had moved in with high hopes of starting fresh, away from the chaos of the city. But she hadn't lasted more than a few months. The neighbors had heard her screaming one night, and when the police arrived, she was gone, her belongings scattered across the house as though she had left in a hurry. The only clue they found was a journal, left behind in the living room, its pages filled with notes about strange occurrences, whispers in the walls, cold spots, the feeling of being watched. I couldn't stop reading. I needed to know what had happened to her, what had driven her to leave so suddenly. The last entry in the journal was chilling. Something is here with me. It's not just the house. It's something in the walls, something older than the house itself. I've seen it. I've heard it. It's watching me. It won't let me leave. I can hear it scratching at the door, whispering my name. I have to get out. I don't know how. But if I stay, I will die. My blood ran cold as I read those words. Emily Hayes had written those words in the same house where I had lived. It was the same terror, the same feeling of being hunted. The same thing that had haunted me was the same thing that had driven her mad. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this town, away from the house, away from whatever dark force had taken hold of it. But even as I turned to leave the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I walked out into the cold afternoon, but the shadows seemed darker than before, thicker, pressing against me. I turned my head to glance back at the library, and in the distance I saw it, just for a moment, a figure standing at the edge of the woods watching me. And then it was gone. Just like that. I couldn't escape it. I knew that now. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, it would always be there, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to turn around. Waiting for me to make the same mistake again. But this time, I wasn't going to make it easy for whatever it was. This time, I was going to fight back. Somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. It was no longer just in my dreams or the quiet whispers in the walls. The sensation followed me everywhere I went, like a shadow that had become a part of me. I would turn corners only to find myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting something to be there. It was always just out of reach, always a moment away from becoming real. The thing was, I didn't know what it was. I couldn't name it, couldn't explain the weight that pressed down on my chest. But I knew this much. It wasn't just some twisted figment of my imagination. The thing that had been haunting me had been haunting others long before me. The curse, the evil that had taken root in that house, wasn't done with me yet. I knew I couldn't just run anymore. Running hadn't worked. I had to face it. I had to confront whatever was pulling the strings, whatever was keeping me tied to that house. I spent the next few days trying to gather my strength, trying to find the courage to go back. But the closer I got to the house, the more my resolve wavered. My hands would shake and my breath would become shallow. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to turn around, but I pressed forward. I had to finish this. I parked my car a little further down the street this time, not wanting to be too close to the house. The fog from the early morning mist had already rolled in, thick and heavy, making everything look unreal. The streets were empty, and the silence felt suffocating. It was as though the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could feel it the moment I stepped onto the property. The air was different here, thicker, colder. It pressed against my skin like 1,000 unseen hands. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark, its silhouette barely visible through the fog. The trees surrounding it swayed gently in the breeze, but everything felt too still, too silent, as if nature itself was holding back. I hesitated at the front door, but the urge to enter was overwhelming. I pushed it open with a creak, and it felt as though the house exhaled a long drawn-out sigh, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, the faint smell of mildew still lingering in the air. But the house felt different this time, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. The weight of the place pressed down on me, threatening to suffocate me. I moved slowly through the house, each room more unsettling than the last. The air felt cold in places, but not like a draft. No, this was a deeper, unnatural cold, as if the very foundation of the house had frozen over. I tried to tell myself it was just the age of the place, the natural settling of the old wood, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I walked into the living room and immediately froze. On the floor, next to the fireplace, lay a pile of dust, freshly disturbed. There were footprints, heavy, dragging footsteps that led from the door to the center of the room. The shape was unmistakable. And then, just beyond the footprints, a small, crumpled piece of paper caught my eye. I bent down to pick it up. It was old, brittle, the edges curling and yellowing with age. But as soon as I saw the writing, I knew it was the journal I had read about, the one Emily had left behind. The handwriting was familiar, though in a way I couldn't explain. It felt like I had seen it before, even though I knew that was impossible. I unfolded the paper carefully, my hands trembling as I read the words scrawled in a frantic, panicked hand. I thought I could get away from it, but it's here again. I hear it at night just beyond the door. The whispering, the scratching. I can feel it watching me. I've made a mistake. I've gone too far. The next line was barely legible, the words smeared and blurred as though the writer had been crying. I've seen it. It's not human. It's not something from this world. I tried to leave, but it won't let me go. It's inside my head now. It's too late. It knows everything. It knows me. The paper slipped from my hands and I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But I knew it was. The same terror that had plagued Emily, that had driven her out of the house, was now creeping through my own veins. It was no longer just a thing that lived in the house. It had followed me. It had come for me. I stood there in the middle of the room, frozen, my mind racing. What did it want? What had I gotten myself into? I thought I was prepared, but now, standing in that room, I felt small and insignificant, like a child facing something far beyond their comprehension. I turned to leave, but that's when I heard it. The sound that had haunted me from the beginning, the creak of the floorboards behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. My breath hitched in my throat, and I slowly backed toward the door, my eyes scanning every corner of the room. And then, as if on cue, the whispering began. It was soft at first, just a faint murmur like the wind in the trees. But then it grew louder. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the very floor beneath my feet seemed to hum with the sound. It was as though the house itself was alive, feeding on my fear. Turn around, the voice whispered. It was the same voice, the same chilling, cold voice from my nightmares. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and running into the cold night air. My heart was pounding in my chest, my lungs burning as I forced myself to run faster, faster than I'd ever run before. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I didn't look back. I thought I had escaped. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left me. Every night, I could hear the whispering just beyond the edge of my sleep. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The shadow in the trees, the thing that had been waiting for me. It wasn't over. It would never be over. And I knew deep down that I would never be free. It's funny how quickly you can convince yourself that you're safe. You tell yourself that you're free, that you've outrun the nightmare, that the thing haunting you has finally let you go. But that's a lie. I knew it was a lie the moment I stepped into my new apartment, away from the house. I should have been relieved. I should have felt safe, the way normal people do when they get out of dangerous situations. But I didn't. The nightmares came as they always do, every time I closed my eyes. Each night was a new version of the same terror, a fresh layer of horror building on the last. But worse still was the feeling that I wasn't alone, even in the waking world. I could sense something lingering in the corners of my vision, something just outside the reach of my awareness, watching, waiting. I tried to ignore it. I went about my daily life trying to convince myself that the house had been just that, an old, unsettling place. Nothing more, nothing less. But the closer I got to the apartment, the more I started to notice things. Little things at first. The way the lights flickered. The way the shadows seemed to stretch in unnatural directions when the sun went down. The way the air always felt heavy even when I opened the windows trying to let in fresh air. It wasn't just the apartment though. It was the city. The streets were empty, the buildings too quiet. People walked with their heads down, eyes glazed over. The world felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. As though someone was watching it all unfold, waiting for something to happen. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the one it was waiting for. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was still haunted by the memories of that house, that old place I had tried so hard to leave behind. But deep down I knew the truth. The house hadn't been the problem. The house had only been the beginning. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened, what had been done. I couldn't just keep running. So I did what I had been avoiding for weeks. I went back to the town, back to that cursed street. I didn't know what I was looking for, some clue, some piece of the puzzle that could explain what had happened, what I had unwittingly unleashed. I had to find the truth, and maybe, just maybe, it would set me free. I parked my car a few streets down, not wanting to draw attention. I knew the house was still there, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Instead, I walked to the town's library. I knew the town had a history, that there were rumors and old stories, but I hadn't bothered to listen before. I thought it was just superstition. Now it felt like the only hope I had left. I stepped into the library, greeted by the familiar smell of old paper and wood. The librarian looked up from behind her desk, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized me. I had come in once before, shortly after I moved to the area, but I hadn't been back since. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, but there was something about her tone that made me hesitate. I need to know about the house on Birch Street," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer immediately, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She seemed to be debating something in her mind before standing up and walking over to a shelf in the back. She pulled a dusty old book from the top shelf, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. It was the kind of book you'd expect to find in a forgotten corner of an old library, the kind that no one ever bothered to open. She handed it to me without a word. "The history of the town," she said simply. "It's all in there." I took the book and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed with age, the print faded in some places, but it didn't matter. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed something to hold on to. My eyes scanned the pages until they landed on a section about Birch Street. It was a short entry, but it sent a chill down my spine as I read the words. Birch Street was once home to a family that was well known for their eccentric beliefs. The family, the Kramers, were rumored to have been involved in dark rituals, practices that many considered to be the work of the occult. They believed in the power of the unseen world, and it is said that they tried to open a door to that world. The description grew more unsettling the further I read. The Kramers had vanished without a trace in the early 1900s, leaving behind their house and their legacy. There were rumors of strange happenings long before I moved in. Doors that opened on their own, lights flickering without explanation, whispers in the walls. And then there it was. The name I had been hoping not to see, Emily Kramer. The woman who had lived in the house before me. She had written about the curse in her journal, had warned me in the pages I had read before. But what I didn't know, what I hadn't understood, was that Emily hadn't been the first to experience the haunting. No, the curse had been there long before her. The house had been cursed for generations, a place that had become a gateway to something darker. The passage described how the Kramers had believed that by performing certain rituals, they could open a door to the other side, a side where spirits, demons, or worse could be summoned. It was a dangerous belief, one that had cost them everything. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the realization hit me. The house had never been just a house. It had always been a place of power, a place where something had been awakened. And whatever had been awakened hadn't been satisfied. It was still there waiting. I slammed the book shut and left the library, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do anymore. I had been so focused on the house, on the curse, on Emily's journal. But I hadn't realized that it wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was me. I couldn't stay in town any longer. The more I thought about the house, the more I realized how deeply it had rooted itself in my mind. The fear wasn't just a distant memory, it was part of me now, woven into the fabric of my everyday life. Every step I took, every breath I drew, I could feel it creeping behind me, always just out of sight but never truly gone. The house had changed me. It had marked me. As I sat in my car, staring at the town from a distance, I knew that I had to leave. I had to get as far away from that place as possible, or I would never escape the curse. But even as the thought crossed my mind, something inside me resisted. There was a pull, an invisible thread that kept tugging at me, urging me to go back. Maybe it was the unresolved questions, the need for closure. Maybe it was the guilt, the sense that I had abandoned something that needed to be understood. But no, I couldn't go back. Not after everything I'd learned. Yet just as I was about to drive off, I saw her. The figure standing by the road just outside the town, near the spot where Birch Street began. Emily Kramer. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. She was standing there, in the exact same spot where I had first seen her months ago. Her hair was wild, her clothes torn, and her eyes wide with terror. She looked like a ghost, as if the years had not been kind to her. But there she was, real and staring right at me. I stepped out of the car, my feet moving on their own, as if some unseen force was guiding me toward her. She didn't say anything when I approached. She just stood there, her eyes locked onto mine, pleading for something I couldn't understand. A memory flickered in my mind, of the journal, of the rituals, of the door the Kramers had opened. Was she trying to tell me something? Had she been trapped in that house just as I had? "Emily," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What do you want from me?" Her lips trembled as she finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, as though she hadn't used it in years. "It's not over," she said, her voice breaking. "It never ends. It never ends." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me grew colder, and the sky above seemed to darken, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Emily's gaze shifted past me, toward the town, toward the house. Suddenly, I realized what was happening. The pull, the fear, the relentless sense of being watched. It wasn't just in my head. The house hadn't let me go. It was still here, still waiting, still haunting me no matter how far I ran. "Don't go back," Emily whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "You can't. It wants you. It always has." Before I could respond, before I could make any sense of what she was saying, she turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. I stood there, frozen in place, the wind howling around me. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the direction of the house. The creaking of floorboards, the sound of doors slamming shut. It was as though the house was calling me back, urging me to return. But I couldn't. Not now. Not after everything I had learned. I got into my car and drove away, the engine roaring as I sped down the road, away from the town, away from Birch Street, and away from the house. I don't know how long I drove for, but when I finally stopped, I was miles away, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. It was over, I told myself. The house couldn't touch me anymore. I had escaped. But as I sat there in the silence, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A shadow, fleeting and quick, moving in the distance behind me. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty road stretching on forever. I don't know if I'll ever be free. Maybe the house is still waiting for me. Maybe it's just a matter of time before it calls me back again. But whatever happens, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. It will never be over. And as the night stretches on, I hear the footsteps again. Soft, deliberate, echoing in the distance. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe, just maybe, it's something much worse. I'll never know for sure. But one thing's for certain. Whatever haunts that house, whatever cursed entity lies in wait, it's not done with me yet. And I know deep down that it never will be. Story 3. It was a cold afternoon when I finally pulled into the driveway of my new home, an old 2-story house that creaked with the weight of years. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, with the houses spaced far apart, as if the people here wanted their privacy. The moving truck had already dropped off my things, and now it was just me in the house, which was more daunting than I had expected. I'd recently gotten divorced. It wasn't a messy separation, but it left a mark, one I wasn't sure I was ready to face. So, when I found this house, it felt like a fresh start. Sure, it was a little rundown and the rent was cheap, but something about it spoke to me. Maybe I was desperate for change, or maybe it was the strange way the house seemed to call out to me from the street. The wooden steps groaned under my weight as I walked up to the front door. It was painted a faded green, chipped in places, but still sturdy. I turned the key and stepped inside, immediately hit by the musty smell of old wood and dust. The walls were bare, save for a few nails where pictures once hung. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored each room, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. As I walked through the narrow hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't that anyone was physically there, but something about the house itself seemed aware. I dismissed it as my imagination running wild, something I hadn't quite gotten control of after the divorce. The first few days passed uneventfully. I unpacked my things, arranged the furniture, and tried to settle into a new routine. It wasn't much different from the life I had before, but I liked the quiet. It felt like I could breathe again. One evening, while I was taking out the trash, I met the neighbor next door, an older woman named Mrs. Greer. She was short and hunched, her back bent with age, but her eyes were sharp, like she was still seeing things clearly that others couldn't. She gave me a slow, measured look as I introduced myself, and after a long pause, she spoke. "That house, it's been through a lot, you know," she said, her voice a soft rasp. "You're not the first to live there, and you won't be the last, I suppose. But it's a house with a history." I didn't ask what she meant, but her words stayed with me long after I went back inside. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but wonder what she was hinting at. The house had a strange feel to it, sure, but I didn't think it was anything more than the creaks and groans of an old building settling. Still, there was something in Mrs. Greer's eyes, a kind of warning, like she knew something I didn't. I shook it off, telling myself it was just a neighbor's way of being nosy. But as the days passed, I started to notice odd things. Small things at first, things that might have been easily explained away, but together they were starting to make me question my assumptions. One night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to move from one end of the hall to the other. I froze, the dish in my hand slipping slightly as I strained to listen. But there was nothing. No more footsteps, no creaks in the floor, nothing out of the ordinary. I told myself it was the house settling, the sound of old wood bending under its own weight. After all, this house was built in the late 1800s and everything in it was made to last, sometimes at the expense of peace and quiet. But as the days passed, the sounds didn't stop. They got worse. The first night, I heard the footsteps again. They were louder this time, coming from the second floor, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway. I went upstairs to check, but the house was empty. No one was there. The next night, it happened again. Footsteps in the hallway, and this time I heard a door creak open. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was going on in this house. The house wasn't empty. Something else was here with me. I went to bed that night with the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. But the strangest part was the smell. The air had changed. It was heavier, colder, almost as if it carried the scent of something old, something long forgotten. I wrapped the blankets around me, hoping that sleep would take me away from this strange new reality, but the footsteps kept me awake. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. Something was happening here. Something I couldn't explain. And it had only just begun. As the moonlight filtered through the window, casting strange shadows across the floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching, waiting. And the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became. The following morning, I told myself I was being irrational. It was just an old house. Old houses creaked and groaned, that was all there was to it. But as I sipped my coffee at the kitchen table, staring at the empty rooms around me, the sense of unease lingered. It wasn't just the noises that unsettled me anymore, it was the feeling that the house itself had some kind of presence, something beyond its age and wear. I had to distract myself. I spent the day unpacking more boxes, setting up my bookshelves, and organizing the little things that made the place feel like home. It helped a little, but every now and then I'd pause and listen. The silence was heavy, like a fog that rolled in, thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the sense that there was something, or someone else in the house with me. That evening, as I stepped outside to take a break, I ran into Mrs. Greer again. She was sitting on her front porch, rocking slowly in her chair, her eyes fixed on the house across the street. The moment she saw me, she motioned for me to come over. "You haven't heard it yet, have you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her sharp eyes scanned my face as if she were reading something I didn't want to share. "Heard what?" I replied, trying to sound casual. She gave a knowing look. "The footsteps. The noises. They start after dark. And they don't stop." I laughed awkwardly, not sure how to respond. "It's probably just the house. Sold, you know? Old houses make sounds." Mrs. Greer's expression didn't change. She studied me with a gaze that was unnervingly direct. "I thought the same thing when I first moved in," she said slowly, her voice low. "But I was wrong. And you will be too." I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but before I could speak, she stood up abruptly as if something had distracted her. She turned toward her house, then paused, glancing over her shoulder with a final, cryptic warning. "Don't let it get to you. But be careful. Not everyone who's lived there has made it out unscathed." I watched her disappear inside her house, the door creaking softly as it closed behind her. Her words hung in the air, far more unsettling than any noise the house had made. I was alone again, but my thoughts felt anything but empty. Something in Mrs. Greer's tone made it clear that there was more to this house than I had imagined. She had lived here for years, and for some reason she was warning me. But about what? That night, the house seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds, the creaks, the distant groans, were quieter, as if the house itself were listening. I tried to focus on my book, but the tension in the air made it impossible to concentrate. Around midnight it started again. The footsteps. But this time they were heavier, faster. As if someone was running through the house. The sound came from upstairs, but it moved, no longer just in the hallway. It was all over the second floor, like someone was pacing frantically from room to room. And then there was the door. The same creaking, the same slow, deliberate sound, as if a door was being opened and closed over and over. I felt my heart racing. I knew I had to investigate, but a part of me didn't want to. The fear was almost paralyzing, like there was something I wasn't supposed to see, something that would change everything. But I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way upstairs. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. When I reached the top of the stairs, the noises stopped. Suddenly, as if whatever had been moving around up there had heard me coming. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there for a moment, listening to the stillness, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. And then I saw it. A door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The room inside was dark, but something about the way the door was positioned made me uneasy. It wasn't the normal way a door would open, more like it had been pushed slightly, just enough to invite curiosity. I felt the air grow colder, and an involuntary shiver ran down my spine. The light from my flashlight flickered as I moved closer. My breath became shallow, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something off about the door, something wrong. I reached out to push it open, but before my fingers even touched the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that made me jump back. My pulse raced, and the flashlight dropped from my hand, clattering to the floor. I didn't move, frozen in place, waiting for the next sound, the next shift in the air. But there was nothing. Just silence. I slowly picked up the flashlight, my hands trembling. The house felt colder now, the air thick with a weight I couldn't explain. I turned and made my way back down the stairs, my heart still pounding. When I reached the bottom, I realized something else. The footsteps had stopped. But I wasn't alone. Something was still in the house with me. I didn't sleep that night. Even as I lay in bed, the image of the figure in the attic and the icy grip on my arm replayed over and over in my mind. The footsteps, they hadn't stopped. Even though I was outside, I could still hear them in the back of my mind, a steady, haunting rhythm. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen, staring at the cup of coffee in front of me without really seeing it. My body ached from the adrenaline, and my head was full of fog. I couldn't go back into the attic. Not yet. But I knew I had to. I needed to understand what was happening. I had to find something, anything, that could explain what was going on, because I couldn't keep living in this state of constant fear. I didn't know what I expected to find, but when I walked through the house, the silence seemed to mock me. It was too quiet, as if the house itself was waiting for me to make the next move. My footsteps felt louder than usual, echoing in the empty halls. I found myself standing in front of the attic door again. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, but then I gripped it tightly. I couldn't keep avoiding it. The attic held something I needed to face. I ascended the stairs once more, every step a battle with my own nerves. This time the air felt different, heavier, like it knew I was coming. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath as I climbed higher. The beam of light cut through the dust, sweeping across the room. But I didn't look around for the figure this time. I knew it would be there, or not, depending on its whim. What I was looking for wasn't something I could see immediately. I needed answers. There was a trunk in the far corner of the room, mostly buried under old sheets and furniture. Something about it drew me in, and I found myself walking toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more I felt the cold bite of the air. I had to open it. The trunk creaked as I lifted the lid, and dust filled the air in a heavy cloud. Inside there were old clothes, brittle paper, and several tattered books, their leather covers cracked and yellowed. One book in particular caught my attention. It was small, bound in black leather, and it looked like it had been opened many times. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the spine, and then I opened it. The pages inside were filled with handwritten notes in spidery script, written in ink that had begun to fade over time. The writing was erratic, almost frantic in places, but I could make out enough to understand the context. The book was a journal. The first entry was dated years ago, back when the house was still young, before the wood had begun to creak and the walls had begun to groan. The writer, a man named Edward Thompson, the same man mentioned in the newspaper article, wrote about his fascination with the occult, about his search for knowledge that went beyond the realm of the living. It seemed harmless at first. He was just a man looking for something more, trying to understand the mysteries of life and death. But as the entries went on, the tone shifted. They became darker, more desperate. He began writing about rituals, chants, symbols he had drawn on the walls of the house. One entry stood out to me, one that made my stomach drop as I read it aloud under my breath. I feel it now. The presence. It watches me. It speaks to me when I sleep, calls my name. I've unlocked something and I fear what it wants. The rituals, they are too powerful. I cannot stop. I fear what I have summoned. The next page was torn as if ripped in a panic. The handwriting was barely legible now, barely even human. The entries became fragmented, broken thoughts scattered across the pages. Words that didn't make sense. Symbols that seemed to repeat over and over. And then the last entry. I have made the door. It is open. It is too late. There is nothing I can do. I hear it now, right behind me. The footsteps. They are here. The final words were smudged, the ink smeared as if the writer had been in a hurry, or worse, trying to escape something. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. The air around me felt charged, like electricity was in the air, buzzing just out of reach. I could almost hear the footsteps again, the slow, deliberate sound of something coming closer. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. But as I turned to go, I felt something shift in the room. The cold deepened, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I heard it, footsteps unmistakable and close. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But I could feel it, feel whatever had been unleashed all those years ago closing in on me. I bolted for the stairs, the journal still clenched in my hand, but as I reached the top step, the door to the attic slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. My heart raced as I fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. And that's when I heard it, soft at first, then louder. Breathing. Ragged, uneven breaths. They were right behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the room was empty. I didn't wait for another second. I shoved the attic door with all my strength and finally forced it open, my breath coming in sharp, frantic gasps. But as I stepped into the hallway, the footsteps didn't stop. They followed me, growing closer, until I was running, my feet pounding against the old floorboards, the sound of something, or someone, pursuing me in the dark. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't know how long I ran. The sound of footsteps pounding after me seemed to echo for an eternity, but no matter how fast I went, I could never escape them. The house, this cursed ancient house, felt alive with every step I took. It was as though the walls themselves were shifting, groaning under the weight of some unseen presence. I finally reached the front door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. It wouldn't open. I pulled harder, frantic now, panicking, my pulse roaring in my ears. I could feel the cold air growing thicker around me, could sense the pressure of something just beyond my reach. My breath came in ragged gasps, the darkness closing in, suffocating. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from fear and exhaustion, the door creaked open. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I just bolted outside into the night air, gulping in the cool breath of the outside world. The world was eerily still, the street lamps casting long shadows along the pavement. My legs felt like jelly, and my mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. I had to get out. I had to leave. But where could I go? I could still hear the footsteps, closer now, right behind me, following me. But when I spun around, there was nothing there. The street was empty, the night silent except for the distant hum of the wind. I had no choice. I had to return to the house. The thought was maddening. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, caught between the fear of what lurked inside and the overwhelming pull of needing to confront it. With a shudder, I turned back toward the house, my eyes scanning the dark windows. There was no way I was going back in without answers. The journal, the rituals, the footsteps, it all had to make sense somehow. I needed to know what I was up against. I had to confront Edward Thompson's legacy. The house loomed in front of me like a dark sentinel. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the silence in the air thick and oppressive. I went inside, this time with more resolve, my heart still racing but determined. The instant I stepped through the door, a chill swept over me. The warmth from outside disappeared, replaced by a biting cold that settled deep into my bones. My breath fogged in the air, swirling in front of me. The house was colder than it had ever been. I took a deep breath and moved into the living room. Everything was still, too still. The air felt thick, almost viscous, as if I were wading through it. As I walked deeper into the house, I thought I heard something. A whisper. It was faint, too faint to make out, but unmistakable. I froze. The whisper came again, just at the edge of my hearing, barely audible but chilling in its tone. Come closer. It was coming from the walls. I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards, through the very air around me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse quickening. I had to get upstairs, back to the attic, back to the source of all this. There was no other way. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold, they were all tied to the house, to what had been done here. I turned toward the stairs, but as I did, the whispering grew louder. Don't leave. I stopped, the hairs on my arms standing on end. My heartbeat thrummed in my ears as I looked around, but there was no one there. No one to explain the voice that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The floorboards creaked under my feet, but not from my weight. The sound seemed to echo from the walls themselves as though they were alive. The house was reacting to me, feeding off my fear. With a gulp, I forced myself to climb the stairs. Each step was a battle against the dread that clawed at my chest, but I had no choice. I had to go up. When I reached the top, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The air was thick, oppressive, almost like it was pressing in on me. I stepped into the hallway, the darkness stretching endlessly in front of me. And then, the whispering started again, louder this time, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Edward. I froze. My stomach turned over in a sickening wave. I looked down the hallway to the attic door. It was slightly ajar. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door. The whispers were growing louder, sharper, more insistent. Edward, come back to us. The voice wasn't just a whisper now. It was a demand, a plea that cut through the air like a blade. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I rushed toward the door, pushing it open with trembling hands. And that's when I saw it. The attic was no longer empty. The shadows in the corners had taken form. A figure stood in the middle of the room, tall and hunched, its back turned to me. I couldn't see its face. The figure was just a silhouette, but I could feel it, feel the weight of its presence. It was more than a ghost, more than a spirit. It was something else, something ancient and hungry. It turned slowly, and for the briefest moment, I saw its face. It wasn't human. The eyes were wide, unnaturally so, dark pools that seemed to suck in all light. Its skin was pale, stretched taut over its bones, and its mouth was twisted in a grotesque grin that didn't belong on a living creature. It opened its mouth, and the whispering intensified, but this time it wasn't just words. It was a screech, a sound so sharp and high-pitched that it tore through my mind like a jagged knife. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. But before I could react, the figure lunged toward me, and I slammed the door shut. I ran. I ran without looking back, not caring about the consequences. All I could think about was escaping, getting out of this place. I didn't stop running until I was outside again, gasping for air. But as I looked back at the house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing in the window, staring at me. And I heard it then. The whisper. You can never leave. I turned and ran. But even as I ran, I could hear it. The sound of footsteps following behind me. The sun had barely risen when I found myself standing in front of the house once more. My legs were stiff, my body exhausted, and my mind was still reeling from what I had just witnessed. How could something like that exist? How could I have encountered it? The chilling encounter in the attic had left me trembling. The image of that twisted figure burned into my mind. But now, with the sun lighting up the streets and the world seemingly normal, a part of me couldn't believe what I had experienced. Had it been a hallucination? My fear getting the best of me? No, I couldn't dismiss it. Not after everything. The footsteps, the cold spots, the whispers. It was all connected, all tied to this place. I hesitated, staring at the house's old, weathered exterior. It seemed so ordinary now. It was just a house, wasn't it? Just a building that had lived through generations. But I knew better than to trust my senses. I had seen what it could do. I could feel the weight of the house pulling me in like a magnetic force, an invisible hand tugging at my insides. Part of me wanted to turn away, to never come back here again, but another part, the part that couldn't let go, drove me forward. I approached the front door slowly, as if it would suddenly slam shut or swallow me whole the moment I stepped inside. But when I tried the handle, it opened easily, the door creaking in a way that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I stepped inside, every muscle in my body on high alert. The house was as cold as it had been the night before, the silence oppressive. The air felt heavy with something I couldn't quite place. My breath was still visible in the dim light, fogging up the space around me. The living room stretched out before me, the familiar creaky floorboards groaning under my feet. I had to find the answers. I had to know what had happened here. The house had been built long ago, and with it came stories that had lingered in the walls for generations. But what if those stories were more than just tales? What if they were warnings? My first stop was the basement. The thought of going down there sent a cold shiver crawling up my spine, but there was no other option. The answers I was looking for had to be somewhere in this house. And if I had to dig through every dark hidden corner to find them, I would. The staircase leading down into the basement was narrow, the air growing colder with each step I took. The smell of mildew and decay clung to the walls. My footsteps echoed down the stairwell, adding to the oppressive silence. When I reached the bottom, the light from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The basement was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, remnants of the house's past. But there was something else, something far more unsettling. There, tucked away in the farthest corner of the room, was a wooden chest. It looked ancient, covered in dust and cobwebs, but it stood out in the gloom like it had been placed there with purpose. I approached it cautiously, every instinct telling me to leave. But I ignored the warning bells in my head and knelt down in front of the chest. The moment I touched the latch, a wave of cold swept over me. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and for a fleeting second I thought I heard whispering again, softer this time, almost like a lullaby. My hand shook as I lifted the lid. Inside, hidden beneath layers of old rags, was a collection of strange objects. Dried herbs, small, intricately carved stones, and, what caught my eye the most, a leather-bound journal. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the thing that might finally give me answers. I pulled the journal from the chest, my fingers brushing over its surface. It felt heavy in my hands and the pages were brittle with age. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the faded ink. The writing was erratic, a mixture of frantic scribbles and neat, methodical notes. It was clear that the journal had been written over a long period of time, as if the author had been slowly descending into madness. The first entry was dated many years ago. It spoke of a man named Edward Thompson, the original owner of the house. The more I read, the more unsettling the entries became. Edward had been obsessed with the occult, with the idea of summoning and controlling forces far beyond human understanding. His obsession had driven him to perform rituals in the very house I now stood in. Rituals meant to open doors to realms unknown. And it seemed that, in his madness, Edward had succeeded. The deeper I read, the more I learned about the curse he had unleashed upon the house. The whispers, the cold spots, the footsteps. They were all symptoms of something that had been brought here. A presence, something that had slipped through the cracks of reality when Edward had opened the door. The journal's final entry was fragmented, almost incoherent, but one line stood out, clear and chilling. Asterisk, it's coming for me. I can hear its footsteps behind me and the walls, they're whispering my name. It knows I opened the door. It knows. Please, if anyone finds this, get out. Leave before it claims you too. Asterisk. I slammed the journal shut, my heart hammering in my chest. This was real. Whatever Edward had unleashed, it was still here, still waiting. I stood up quickly, the weight of the journal heavy in my hands. The air around me grew thick again, the coldness wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I could feel it in the walls, in the floorboards beneath my feet. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, and they were getting closer. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the shadows, I saw the figure again. It was closer now. It was no longer a distant silhouette. The thing was standing right in front of me, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on mine. The grin, it was there, stretched wide and grotesque, filling my vision. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on me. The air was suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I thought I might faint. But I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. I was trapped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only stare at the figure, frozen in fear as it slowly advanced. You can never leave, it whispered. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The house fell silent. The footsteps stopped. The air cleared. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, or if it was just another trick of my mind, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to leave this cursed house behind. I ran, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was a mile away, the house now a dark silhouette in the distance. But even then I could hear the footsteps. And I knew deep in my bones that whatever it was, whatever haunted that house, it wasn't finished with me. Not yet. It would follow me. Always. The house, the curse, it would never let me go. I couldn't escape. Not physically, not mentally. The house was still there, its presence lingering like a dark cloud overhead. Even though I had left it months ago, I could feel its weight pressing on me, suffocating me. It was like a nightmare that wouldn't end. The shadows of the house clung to my thoughts, creeping in at the most unexpected moments. And then the dream started again. At first they were harmless, just vague, disjointed images of the house, the cold, the dark corners that seemed to swallow everything in sight. But soon they became more vivid, more real. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the whispering, the lullaby, even though I was miles away from that house. It was as though the house had claimed a piece of me, and now it wouldn't let go. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was pitch black, but I could still feel the weight of something in the air. A presence. I tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't go away. The shadows seemed to stretch and crawl, twisting in unnatural ways. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, just the aftereffects of the nightmare I had been trapped in. But then I heard it. A soft creaking. Then another. Footsteps. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking around the room, testing the floorboards with each step. I strained my ears, trying to listen, but the sound was muffled as if it was coming from inside the walls. I jumped out of bed, my legs shaky, and rushed to the door, but it was locked. Panic surged through me as I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew louder, and I could hear the faint whispering like the walls were speaking to me. I pressed my ear against the door, listening closely. "Come back, come back." The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was calling to me. The same voice that had haunted my dreams. I backed away, my body trembling. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I was trapped in this room, in this house, with whatever was haunting me. I could hear the whispering grow louder, more urgent, as if it was getting closer. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The house went silent, the footsteps gone, the whispers fading into nothingness. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was all in my head, a twisted trick of my mind. But then I saw it. A shadow in the corner of the room. It was tall, too tall, and its form was blurry, shifting like it couldn't decide if it wanted to be human or something else. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my breath caught in my throat. It was standing there, waiting for me to make a move, but I couldn't. The air was thick with dread, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get away, to escape. But the house, the thing, it wouldn't let me go. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Leave me alone." The shadow didn't respond. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, as if it were waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty again, the silence deafening. But the fear still lingered. It was like a weight on my chest, a constant reminder that I was not alone, that something was always watching, always waiting. I collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. I grabbed my things, my hands shaking as I packed whatever I could into a bag. I didn't care what I took. I just needed to get out. I ran to the door again, but this time it opened easily. The hallway outside was dark, but there was a faint light coming from the window at the end of the hall. I ran toward it, not daring to look back. As I reached the front door, I felt a chill run down my spine. I just knew that the house was still there, still calling to me, still trying to pull me back into its darkness. I ran outside and into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that house. But as I looked back one last time, I saw it. The house, looming in the distance, its windows dark and empty, like eyes watching me. And in that moment, I realized something. It was never over. The house hadn't finished with me. It would never finish with me. It would follow me always, and I would never be free. I had escaped the house, but the house had never truly left me, and it never would. I didn't sleep for days after I left. The fear, the dread, it had followed me, clinging to me like a second skin. Every corner I turned, every creak in the floor, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, everything reminded me of the house. It was as though I had never really escaped. I tried to move on, to find peace, but it was hard. The fear that gripped me had a life of its own. It grew stronger with each passing day, feeding off my anxiety, my sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the shadow, tall, featureless, haunting. I told myself it was over. The house was behind me in the past. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. I could hear it. In the silence of my new place, I could almost hear the faintest whisper of footsteps following me. In the dark corners of my apartment, I could feel the presence of something watching, waiting. The therapist I started seeing told me it was just trauma, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that the house was a symbol of everything I had tried to escape, my divorce, my past, my failures. But the therapist didn't know. She didn't understand. She didn't know what I had seen, what I had felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of my perception. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, cold sweat on my skin, heart racing, and I'd swear I could hear the faintest creaking of floorboards, the soft whisper of a door opening, just as I had heard it in the house. But it was all in my head, right? That's what I kept telling myself. It was only when I received a letter that I truly understood. It was a plain envelope, nothing special, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in jagged handwriting, as though the words were desperate to be read. I know what you saw. I know what you felt. You can't escape. It's still watching. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced back to the house, to the shadow, to the whispers. How did someone know? Who had sent this? The letter continued. Don't come back. It's too late for you. But for the others, there's still time. Don't let them fall into the same trap. Don't let them suffer like you did, I felt a chill sweep over me as I read the words again. It was like they were alive, crawling under my skin. Who could have sent this? Had someone else experienced what I had? Was there someone else who had been touched by that house, by the curse that had gripped me so tightly? And then I remembered something that had slipped my mind, buried deep under the weight of my fear and desperation. The journal. I had left it behind. In the chaos of my escape, I had forgotten to bring it with me. The journal that had detailed the dark rituals, the curses, the twisted history of the house. The journal that I had thought would hold the answers, the key to understanding what had happened to me. I couldn't leave it behind. It was too important. But going back to that place, to the house, it felt like a death sentence. It felt like walking straight into the darkness, to face whatever had been following me all this time. But I had to know. I had to understand. The letter had been a warning, but it also felt like a call. A call to return. I didn't know what I expected when I went back to the house. I didn't know if I could handle seeing it again. But I had to face it. I had to finish what I had started. The house stood at the end of the street just as I remembered it. Its dark, decaying walls, the empty windows that stared back at me like hollow eyes. It hadn't changed. It hadn't aged a day. It was still there waiting. I stood outside for what felt like hours, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay just like before. I could feel the shadows, thick and suffocating, stretching out toward me. The house was alive. It seemed breathing in the night air, calling me in. With a deep breath, I walked toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. It was cold, too cold, but it turned easily and I stepped inside. The familiar scent of dust and rot hit me immediately. The house felt like a prison, its walls closing in around me, its creaking floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I felt it again, that chilling presence just beyond the corner of my vision. I made my way upstairs toward the room where I had left the journal. The house seemed to groan in protest with every step I took. It didn't want me here. I could hear it in the whispers that filled the air, soft but insistent. When I reached the room, I was nearly overwhelmed by the feeling of being watched. I quickly scanned the room, my eyes landing on the small desk where the journal had been. It was still there, sitting untouched, the leather cover worn and cracked. I grabbed it, clutching it to my chest as if it were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it. The footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Heavy. They were coming from behind me. I froze, heart pounding, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were unmistakable, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking through the room behind me, following my every move. My pulse raced, and I couldn't bring myself to turn around. Every part of my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The footsteps continued, closer now. I could feel them, the weight of each step, the presence growing nearer. It was as if the house itself was breathing, the air thickening, the walls closing in. I didn't dare turn around. I knew that if I did, I would see it. That shadow. That thing that had haunted me since the moment I stepped foot inside this place. The journal in my hands felt cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had absorbed the dread that filled the room. The whispering grew louder, almost intelligible now, and I could swear I heard my name being called from the dark corner of the room. But there was no one there. I took a shaky step toward the door, my legs trembling. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. My body moved before my mind could process it, and I darted for the door, slamming it open. The house groaned as if protesting my departure, but I didn't care. I had to get out. But as I stepped into the hallway, the temperature dropped. A chill spread through the air, sinking into my skin, making my teeth chatter. I turned to look behind me, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something move, something large, shadowy, and fast. Then came the sound, louder now, unmistakable. The creaking of the stairs. Something was coming up behind me, climbing the stairs, one slow step at a time. I ran. I bolted down the hallway, my heart in my throat, my breath ragged and desperate. I could hear it following me, just behind, just out of reach. The footsteps were closer now, louder, quicker, as though whatever it was gaining on me. It was close. So close. I reached the stairs, my feet stumbling as I ran down, the banister cold under my fingers. But the air around me seemed to shift, thickening, constricting. I could feel it, whatever it was, right behind me, its presence almost tangible. It was like being smothered, suffocated by a weight I couldn't see but could feel, closing in around me. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the door, but it was no longer open. The house had shut me in. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the handle, yanked on it, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was trapped. And then the footsteps stopped. Silence. The house, the room, everything fell into a thick, suffocating silence. It was worse than the footsteps. The quiet. The stillness. I could feel it, the anticipation. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to make a move, to turn around. I knew I was trapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around, slowly, unwillingly. And there it was. The shadow. It was standing at the top of the stairs, just beyond the landing, too tall, too unnatural. Its form was indistinct, shifting in and out of focus, as though it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. The air around it shimmered, vibrating with an energy that made my skin crawl. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching. The cold in the room deepened, seeping into my bones. I could hear my own heartbeat loud in my ears, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, my mind like mush. The shadow's presence was overwhelming, drowning out everything else. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanished into the darkness. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it real? The house felt empty again, but the fear remained. The sensation of being watched lingered in the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The door was still locked, but now the lock turned easily. I ran. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I didn't care about the consequences of leaving everything behind. The only thing that mattered was getting out. I pushed open the door, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I stepped outside. But the feeling didn't go away. The fear. The presence. It was still there, following me, haunting me. I had escaped the house, but the house had never left me. I couldn't escape it, no matter how far I ran. It was inside me now, in my mind, in my soul. The curse was a part of me. And I realized as I walked away from that place, that I would never be free. The house had claimed me, and it would never let go. I didn't stop running. My feet were heavy with exhaustion, my chest tight with fear, but I didn't dare slow down. Every breath felt sharp, every step like an anchor, but still I couldn't bring myself to stop. I ran down the street, my eyes darting back and forth, as if expecting to see that shadow lurking in the corners of my vision, waiting for me to falter. The moon hung in the sky like a pale sentinel, casting long shadows across the empty road. The houses, silent and lifeless, seemed to watch me as I passed. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I feared I'd see it, asterisk at asterisk, the shadow following me, closing in. I stumbled toward the nearest gas station, the fluorescent lights flickering above like a warning. I hadn't even realized I had come this far, but I knew one thing for certain. I needed help. I needed to talk to someone, anyone who could tell me I wasn't losing my mind. I stepped inside, greeted by the faint hum of the refrigerators and the buzz of the lights. Behind the counter stood a young man, barely older than I was. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, a look of curiosity crossing his face as I approached. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded quickly, trying to compose myself. I think I need a place to stay, just for the night. I don't know what's going on. The man studied me for a moment, then nodded. "There's a motel down the road. They won't ask too many questions." I thanked him, stumbling out of the station and into the cold night air. My legs felt like jelly and my mind was a whirl of panic. My thoughts were clouded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still there, still waiting. I made my way to the motel, paying for a room with shaky hands and a forced smile. The clerk didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in his paperwork. He handed me the key with a detached look, and I hurried down the hall to my room. The door creaked as I opened it, and I stepped inside. The room was small, but at least it was private. It was a temporary escape, a place where I could catch my breath. But even in the relative safety of the motel, the unease never left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the walls, trying to calm my racing heart. But the silence was deafening. My thoughts spiraled. The house, the shadow, the footsteps. They were all there, lingering, chasing me. I heard a soft sound, a tap, 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 on the window. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned slowly, dread crawling up my spine. There was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just the dark reflection of the parking lot outside. My breathing came in short, shallow bursts, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just the wind, a trick of the light. But then the tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up, my legs shaking. I could feel it now, the weight of the air around me, thick with tension. The temperature had dropped, the chill creeping in as if the room itself was being drawn into the coldness of the house I had left behind. I approached the window cautiously, my fingers trembling as I reached for the blinds. I pulled them aside, but all I could see was darkness. The parking lot was empty. No one was out there. The tapping stopped. I exhaled a shaky breath, but it didn't feel like a release. It felt like a warning. A warning that I wasn't alone. That whatever had followed me had found me again. I backed away from the window, but as I turned to face the room, I felt it. The cold. It was inside the room now, a biting, unnatural chill that sank deep into my bones. The door to the bathroom creaked open by itself. I froze. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see. I knew what was waiting for me. I had seen it before, but I couldn't stop myself. My legs moved on their own, carrying me to the bathroom door, which had swung open just enough to show the darkness beyond. A faint whisper echoed from within. I couldn't hear the words, but I could feel them. The air was thick with something, a presence, asterisk at asterisk, and it was close. The door slammed shut and I jumped back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I backed away into the corner of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't think, as the shadows in the room stretched, curling around me like tendrils. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The room was still. The silence was unbearable. I knew it wasn't over. I knew it was just playing with me, toying with my fear. But there was something else too, something darker. The feeling that I wasn't alone in the room, that whatever had been in that house was here with me now. Watching. Waiting. I didn't know how long I sat there, my back pressed against the cold wall, my eyes darting around the room. The clock on the nightstand ticked away the minutes, but it felt like hours. And then I heard it again, the faintest whisper. My name. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was in my head, in my ears, a sound that wasn't real but somehow felt so real. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the whisper grew louder, closer. Come back. My eyes snapped open, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, dimly lit room. Yet the presence was palpable, suffocating. The house had never really let go. It was here, in the air, in the shadows, in my mind. I ran to the door. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape, but there was nowhere left to run. The room, the entire motel, the street, the town, felt like a trap. I could still feel it, that cold, unnatural presence following me, stalking me just like it had done in the house. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, pulling at the handle in desperation. But it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I could feel it. The unmistakable weight of the lock holding me inside. My pulse roared in my ears, and I could almost hear the faint whispers behind me again, growing louder, more insistent. Come back. I jerked at the door harder, but it wouldn't open. My mind was spinning in a frenzy. There was no escape. No matter where I went, it followed. The house wasn't just a building. It was a part of me now, seeping into my bones, into my very soul. I turned back to the room looking for something, anything, to help me. But there was nothing. The same empty walls, the same harsh light, the same suffocating silence. The air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping further, until I was shivering uncontrollably. It was then I noticed it. The mirror above the dresser. It was cracked just slightly, but enough for me to catch a glimpse of something. Something in the reflection behind me. I turned, my body frozen in terror. But there was nothing there. Nothing at all. I spun back to the mirror, staring at it with wide eyes. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But the crack was still there, growing slightly wider as if the glass was breathing. The chill in the air intensified and I could feel the whispering again, only now it wasn't just in my head. It was in the room, coming from the mirror, from the walls, from the very ground beneath me. Come back. I rushed to the door again, desperate, frantically pulling at the handle. I knew it was pointless. But I couldn't stop. My mind was a whirlwind of panic, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might explode. And then, just when I thought I might lose myself completely, the door opened. Not the handle. It was the lock. It clicked, suddenly, without warning, and the door swung wide open. I stood there, frozen in place, staring into the dark hallway. The same hallway I had run through just hours before, the same one that had led me to the outside world. But now it felt different. It felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. The silence was deafening, and yet I could hear my heart hammering in my chest, echoing in my ears. The house was calling me back. I stepped out into the hallway, hesitant, but somehow drawn forward, as if something was pulling me, dragging me, back toward that cursed place. The temperature dropped even further. My breath came in visible clouds now, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing against my skin. Come back. The whispering was louder now. It was no longer just a voice. It was a presence, an entity all around me, in every crevice, in every shadow. I could feel it crawling under my skin, filling my mind with dread. I stepped forward, drawn by the pull of the house. I didn't want to go back. I didn't. But my legs moved on their own, as if the house had already claimed me, as if it were taking me back whether I liked it or not. I passed the stairs, the hallway stretching before me, dark and ominous. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing around me. The house groaned. The familiar creaks and moans that had once felt so normal now felt like the warning of something horrible lurking just beyond the threshold. And then I saw it. The shadow. The same shadow that had haunted me from the moment I entered this place. It was standing at the far end of the hallway, its form shifting and twisting in the dark, as if it were a part of the very darkness itself. I froze again, my blood running cold. It wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was in the air, in the walls, in me. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The shadow stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, as if it were savoring my fear. The temperature plummeted even further, and I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. The darkness around it seemed to warp, twisting in unnatural ways. And then I heard it again, clearer this time, its voice echoing in my mind. Come back. I wasn't sure if I was still in the hallway or if I had crossed into something else entirely. The world felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The shadow lunged. It wasn't physical. It wasn't anything I could touch. But I could feel it, the overwhelming presence of it, as if it had consumed everything in its path. I stumbled backward, but the shadow followed. I was trapped. There was no way out. The house had me. I heard a sudden crash. The house groaned and shook as if it were coming alive, the walls creaking and splintering around me. But the shadow didn't stop. It didn't even hesitate. It was moving faster now, closing the distance between us, and I could hear its breath, low, raspy, like something ancient and hungry. And then I understood. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just some curse. The house had been built on something asterisk, that had been waiting. And now it had found its next victim. Me. The last thing I remember was the shadow reaching out, its form stretching impossibly long, its touch colder than anything I'd ever felt. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was outside again, but the world was different. The air was thick with the same suffocating silence, and I could hear the faint whispering in the distance. Come back. I didn't look back, but I knew deep down that the house would always be waiting.